Recording in progress.
Can you all hear this? Glasses. Good evening, everyone. This is a special meeting of the Newton City Council and Committee of the Whole with the Zoning and Planning Committee presiding on Wednesday, February 15th, 2023. We have a number of people here in chambers and a lot of folks on Zoom, so I'm going to ask the clerk to help me recognize folks as I go forward. But I first would like to recognize the members of the committee who are in the room, which is President and Councilor Albright at large from Ward 2, Councilor Allison Leary at large from Ward 1, and Councilor Holly Ryan, Ward Councilor from Ward 8, and I'm Deb Crossley, Chair of the Zoning and Planning Committee at large from Ward 5. And online, I see Councilor Krinsman, Josh Krinsman at large from Ward 4, and Councilor Vicki Danberg at large from Ward 6, who is Vice Chair of the committee. We are also joined by Director Barney Heath. Oh, and thank you, I couldn't see. Councilor Wright has joined us as well at large from Ward 3. She is also on the committee. Other councilors who are in the room with us, which is very nice, thanks for coming in, are Councilor Andrea Downs, Councilor Rick Lipoff, Councilor David Kalis. And then, can you help me out here? All right. Oh, good. Okay, Councilor Alicia Bowman, Councilor Becky Grossman, Councilor Bill Humphrey, Councilor Mark Laredo, Councilor Tariq Lucas, Councilor Chris Markowitz, Councilor John Oliver. I see we are also joined by Commissioner Lojek. Welcome back to the city, by the way, and we'll be calling on you in a while. And I see Councilor Kelly has joined us and Councilor Gentile has joined us. So I'm going to, if other folks join, you can tell me. I'll try to recognize folks before we begin, if that's possible. The item before us, it's only one, it's 477-22, and it's more than half the council requesting a discussion with the sustainability team and planning department about the new Massachusetts Building Energy Code amendments, the base code and stretch code, and to consider adopting the specialized energy code pursuant to the entirety of 225 CMR 22 and 23, which include appendices RC and CC. That's just for the record. Co-director of Sustainability, Ann Berwick, has joined us for the evening, and she will be introducing Ian Finlayson of DOER when he is ready to give an overview of this topic. I just want to say a few words. Ms. Berwick has been working diligently with me in many cases, but very much on her own, preparing materials for this hearing. Building codes and understanding them, if you're not in the building professions and using them all the time, is not material that is easy to digest. Many of you have said that to me. But the attempt in this packet was to really focus on the information that's key to this evening and key to the job we have to do tonight. So I want to say for everyone who's listening, because I know that a lot of folks who are on the Zoom were here 13 years ago when the city of Newton in one night adopted and was the first city in the Commonwealth to adopt the first stretch code on October of 2009. And in your packet, you see a very brief board order that voted to accept that and to set a date for the effective date of the stretch code at the time. That is what we have to do tonight. The stretch code is now in full force and effect. We've been a stretch code community for all that time, and the stretch code has become more stringent over that time by relatively small increments until this year. The stretch code that is now in force and effect as of January 1st of this year it was automatic for us, and the 299 communities, including Newton, who are now stretch code communities. But something called the specialized code is what is before us for consideration. So it goes a step beyond the stretch code, which we will try to describe in detail tonight. Mr. Finlayson, in particular, will be focusing his presentation on what are the distinctions between what's already in effect. And by the way, the stretch code that's in effect now actually has dates in the future where it becomes more stringent. And he's promised to give us a timeline so we can understand exactly what that means. We will not, if we choose to adopt the specialized code tonight, or recommend it to the full council tonight, we will not be the first community to do so. There are 4 communities who right out of the gate in early January voted to adopt the specialized code. And they are making it effective as of July of this year. The DOER recommends that we give a 6-month grace period, I'll call it, at least 6 months before we make it effective if we choose to adopt it, and that we align our calendar with the normal calendar of adopting amendments to the building code, which means it would become effective, if we did that, become effective either in January 2024 or July of 2024, since we are near the end of February. So we need to decide whether we want to adopt the code, and then we need to decide on the date we want to recommend it to be effective. So we will take a straw vote on the latter if we vote to affirm the former, if we're ready to vote tonight. So I would like first, I would like to begin the process here. Actually, I want to say one more thing, just for the folks who are listening, and I sent this out twice. In your packet, in your Friday packet, behind the agenda, were all of the 8 items to help inform this matter. And I also emailed it out to the members of the council and folks who had expressed interest in coming in to speak tonight. And we will be referring to many of those things. In particular, there's an FAQ, there's Ms. Berwick's summary of both the residential code and another one of the commercial codes. There's a letter from Josh Morse describing how this would impact the city and basically supporting its adoption. More information on the 10 Communities Act and more information on other related items that are before us, like the 10 Communities program and BERDO. So now I would like to introduce Ms. Berwick. If you could unmute, I believe you've been made a co-host so that you can speak. And please introduce Mr. Finlayson, who I understand is also with us now.
Yes, Councilor Crossley, thanks for the opportunity. And it's really an honor for me to introduce Ian Finlayson, who's the Deputy Director of the Energy Efficiency Division of the State Department of Energy Resources. That's really a mouthful and not what you really need to know about Ian. What you need to know is that he's the guy at DOER when it comes to building codes. He's been the Massachusetts policy lead on building energy codes for the past 15 years, including leading the development of the original stretch code in 2008 and the updated stretch code and the new specialized code that we're discussing tonight. In other words, he's really the one who writes these codes, so he deserves our admiration. And maybe for those like me who are not codes natives, our sympathy. Ian is also the big picture guy, which is a rare combination. I want to add that I worked with Ian in the Patrick administration for several years, and he's a good friend. We're so lucky to have him here tonight.
That's quite the introduction, Anne. Thank you. And it's a pleasure to be back in front of Newton City Council. I certainly don't recognize all of you on the council, and I think even the structure of Newton government has changed since I was last here. But it's definitely nice to be here. Should I proceed with the presentation, or?
Yes, please. I believe you need to share your screen, and the clerk will facilitate that.
Yep, I can do that. Okay, hopefully you're seeing a title slide. So I will try and run through some slides fairly quickly because I recognize your time is valuable. I have additional slides if needed for different question topics. We've had a number of these presentations now across the state. So hopefully I've got your bases covered, but I'm happy to take any questions and at any time if you indicate that you'd like me to pause or address something. With that, I'll get started. I'll try and get started. Okay, here we go. So just some policy context, which you may already be familiar with. And I'm representing the Department of Energy Resources here. So this is obviously a perspective of the now Healy administration and the Energy Office on this. So we have a 50% reduction in greenhouse gas legal limit by 2030. That led to some of these policies. And the legislature passed 3 different acts that really influence what's available to you as building code options. The stretch code, the specialized code, and then most recently this 10 community fossil fuel free demonstration program. I wasn't planning to talk a lot about the fossil fuel free demonstration program, partly because it's a tongue twister, but I think that's not your main focus tonight, but I can take questions on whatever topic you wish. So now that we have the specialized code, we have a new updated map of the state. I think as Councillor Crossley summarized already, we've had 4 cities so far adopt the specialized code. They're in the sort of darker blue, probably too small for you to see. And we have 300 communities that have the stretch code. We're regarding specialized code communities as stretch and specialized rather than stretch or specialized, because the specialized is really the stretch code with some additional decarbonization focused measures. But it's sort of 90% stretch code and then an additional 10%. But that 10% makes a big difference on the emissions front. So these are the 3 choices in front of the City of Newton or any other municipality in Massachusetts in terms of what energy code that you'd like to have. And I'm trying to use this color coding a little bit through this deck to kind of help where we jump from stretch code to specialized code. So I hope none of you are colorblind, but if you are, the words will also help. And I think one of the central questions we get from people is about the timeline. So there are some dates in these boxes, but I think it's easier to show this in a flow chart. So here's a simplified timeline for the stretch code. So on the left-hand side, in January 1st of this year, the residential stretch code updated. And we can talk more about what's in that if you want. It was a relatively modest update for new construction, but it had a bigger impact on additions and renovations, but only the very big versions of additions and renovations. And then the commercial and multifamily update takes effect this July, and we're rolling out training and resources for the design community on that right now. And then in a year from then, July of 2024, then both the residential and the multifamily commercial get slightly more stringent. So it's a gradual phase in, and I think that is helpful when you have 300 communities and an awful lot of designers, builders, developers, and code officials are trying to get to grips with these changes. So to contrast that, the specialized code with this lovely shade of green as opposed to the blue, the timeline is really driven by when a community chooses to adopt, if they choose to adopt. So I put in the timeline that I think is most relevant for Newton tonight, but obviously that's up to you really on that timeline. This is just a recommendation from DOER. So between now and July, for communities that have town meeting or for Newton as a city council, you can choose to take action on the specialized code. If you choose to adopt it in the same way as you adopted the stretch code, then we recommend that starting in July, you have a 6-month phase-in period, and then the specialized code for you would take effect January 1st of 2024. That's slightly earlier than the shift in stretch code changes that I showed on the previous slide, which take effect in July of 2024. So let's talk about what that means for different building types. And I'll start with the residential sector, both low rise first and then multifamily, because that's where a lot of the action is. And the easiest way to talk about energy in the residential sector, particularly for low rise, is to talk about HERS ratings. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of what a HERS rating is, and then you can sort of see how that has progressed over time. So a HERS rating is an index score of the energy performance of a house or a unit in a multifamily building, where 100 is the minimum national code in 2006, and 0 is a net zero home. And you can see on the right there that in Massachusetts, for the last couple of years that we have data for, our average has been right about in the middle of those two at 51. And in Massachusetts, because of the stretch code mostly, but also we allow it in the base code, HERS ratings have become the most common way for single family and multifamily to demonstrate energy code compliance. So I think it was 87% of new residential units used a HERS rating in 2020 and 2021. So with that context, you can kind of see how the stringency of the energy code has increased over time, and the difference between the base code, which has HERS as an option but not a requirement, and then the stretch code in blue, where a HERS rating is required, and then this new specialized code option. And at the far right there in 2024, you'll see that the stretch code and the specialized code will catch up to each other on the HERS rating. So on the HERS rating front, there isn't a major difference between stretch and specialized. but there are some nuances that are important. So I thought that a couple of tables might be the easiest way to digest the differences between stretch and specialized. So again, using that color scheme of stretch in blue and specialized in green. And I would note there's also a slight time difference. The stretch code changes don't take effect until July of 2024. The specialized code depends on when you adopt it, but if you adopt it, did it effective in January, it would be slightly sooner. You can see that for all electric buildings that are residential, there isn't actually a difference. The differences kick in for what we call mixed fuel buildings. A mixed fuel building is a building that uses fossil fuels or biomass, really for any of the main services, space heating or water heating, or could be a gas dryer or a gas fireplace. So, and any of those uses are allowed, but they trigger additional requirements in the specialized code. And so the changes here are primarily on the mixed fuel building side, and that's definitely the case for low-rise residential. So if you want to have for example, a gas heated building in Newton, or it could be propane, it almost certainly wouldn't be oil, because we just don't see new homes built with oil anymore because it's inefficient. Then that would trigger a requirement for solar on the house, and anything that was using gas or propane, for example, like hot water, there would need to be the wiring in place to switch that over to an electric use later on. And what's driving that is our need to meet our greenhouse gas reductions. And in turn, that really requires us to be able to phase out fossil fuel use in the next few decades. The other significant thing for residential, which I think would matter in Newton, is that new homes over 4,000 square feet, in addition to requiring solar if they are mixed fuel, would have to have enough solar to get to HERS 0. Now, HERS 0 might look like a big difference from HERS 42, but a regular solar panel installation of about 4 kilowatts will reduce the HERS rating by about 25 to 30 points. So getting to HERS 0, once your base building is already at 42, is going to require a solar system in the order of, let's say, 7 or 8 kilowatts, which is actually the average size now in Massachusetts for homes. On the multifamily side, there are some differences even in the all-electric pathway. In multifamily, in the stretch code, we allow 3 different choices for how you comply. The HERS pathway that we've been talking about for low-rise is allowed. There's a new pathway called the Thermal Energy Demand Intensity Pathway, or TEDI. That's really a simplified model for the building. And then the Passive House pathway, which has become a very common pathway for multifamily in Massachusetts, but just in the last 2 or 3 years. Whereas in the specialized code, we just make it simple and say you have to comply with Passive House. There are a couple of different Passive House standards, but that sort of keeps it simple. And then for mixed fuel, again, you have just that one Passive House compliance pathway choice. And as with low-rise residential, and you'll see it in commercial as well, if you have any fossil fuel uses, then you have to have the wiring in place to electrify those in the future, so that the upgrades that will be needed cost less than if the equipment, if the wiring is not there in the first place. Okay, a major change in the stretch code is around additions and alterations. I wasn't going to cover that right now, but we might want to come back to that if there are questions. So I'm just flagging that that's there. And I wanted to just go on to commercial buildings and talk about stretch versus specialized again. So I don't have something as simple as a HERS rating to describe the changes in the commercial stretch code. But essentially, we've changed our philosophy on the commercial stretch code from just looking at a general reduction in overall building use, which in the current stretch code is a 10% reduction for commercial buildings, to a much more focused look at heating and cooling demands. The reason for the heating focus is that that's where the fossil fuel use is in commercial buildings. You're not using fossil fuels directly for anything really except heating, whether that's water heating or space heating. Everything else is electric already. And we're doing a great job electrifying, cleaning our electric grid. So given that the goal of the specialized code is to help us with fossil fuel reductions, it made sense to shift our focus to heating. The other benefits of that are also considerable in terms of resilience and longevity and public health and so on for the building. Okay, there are a number of other changes that, again, we can come back to if there are questions. I want to get to the differences between stretch and specialized. So using our table format again, I'm dividing commercial buildings that aren't multifamily into two groups. And again, I think this is going to be relevant for Newton because municipal buildings and schools, as well as office buildings, are getting their own treatment in both the stretch code and the specialized code in a way that they haven't in the past. And you'll see that, again, if you're all electric in the design of a school or, say, a police station, then there's really no difference between stretch and specialized because our grid is screening quickly, and we think that being all electric is going to meet our climate goals. But if you have a building where you want to have a fossil fuel use, then we have a requirement for wiring that for future electrification, and also a solar PV requirement on site, provided the site has solar access. The same is sort of repeated for other commercial buildings, but they have a third option in terms of code compliance, which I'll just refer to as the ASHRAE option, which is similar to the current stretch code. And that really sums it up. I have a slide on when solar is triggered, which is really only when you're using fossil fuels. And we can talk in more detail about that. I do think, though, we want to talk about costs a little bit. So we spent a couple of years with leading building developers and code consultants with a team working on residential buildings and a separate team working on commercial buildings, really looking at all of this. And actually, I'm going to go to the next slide and come back to this one. And what they found was that in all cases, we could lower the life cycle cost of all building types by just having a better design strategy. And this was using utility costs in 2020 and 2021 before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Since then, utility costs for all fuels have gone up, but that's only improved the life cycle cost effectiveness of our studies because we're comparing using less energy to using more energy. And so when energy costs more, the return on your investment is shorter. We don't know how long those prices can remain elevated. So we're just sticking with the cost analysis that we've already done, as opposed to updating it, but it could be done. So there are economic advantages to the property owners, and in general, that's going to help the tax base of a city or town. There are also incentives for builders and developers, which I think is appropriate given that there's some significant changes here in what they're looking to build. So for residential builders, the Mass Save program has rolled out a new all-electric homes program with significant incentives. For a while now, there's been a multifamily passive house program. We now have a little over 10,000 units of multifamily housing signed up for that program to get that $3,000 a unit incentive. And then the federal government acted last year to renew and expand the tax credits for builders and developers. So there are now significant tax credits. On the residential side, it's 45L, which basically builds on PERS ratings, and passive house is also compatible. And then on the commercial side, it's 179D. So I won't go into the details of those, but they improve the cost effectiveness of the projects that we already assessed. And so you'll see the sort of second bullet on this cost side is that some buildings are actually cheaper to build with this new design approach once you factor in the incentives. All buildings are cheaper from day one if you have a 30-year mortgage. So for residential home buyers, if they're buying in cash, then they probably don't care so much about the utility costs, but they're going to be ahead on day one. And if they're buying with a 30-year mortgage, they're also going to be ahead on day one. So that's very reassuring. My last slide is just to reiterate the process, but I think Councillor Crossley went over that already. So perhaps I would pause there and just flag that we are taking questions on this. So this is the way to formally ask us questions offline. And you can ask me any questions this evening if you want. I'll answer in real time. And I can also provide a copy of slides if that would be helpful.
Thank you very much, Ian. Really appreciate that you could join us tonight. I know you're very busy, there's an understatement, explaining this across the state. I believe that Ms. Berwick has the first question for you, and then I would like to go to two people from within the city departments, one in absentia, I think, but to talk about impacts on the city. But Ms. Berwick, you had a question to begin, I believe.
Yes, I did. Thank you for that, Ian. Can you, in more digestible form, I'm sure you can present it in more digestible form than I have been able to do, describe exactly what counts as residential and what counts as commercial?
Sure. So for the energy code, we actually use the National Model Energy Code definition for low-rise residential. And so that allows, and the idea of differentiating comes from allowing home builders to use sort of one code book for everything instead of having to refer to a whole set of commercial code books. But so that definition essentially is a single family, two family, townhouses, and then three categories of multifamily building that are 3 stories in height or less. So it covers things like assisted living or single room occupancy, sort of sheltered housing, those types of situations as well. What it doesn't include that's 3 stories or less are short-term occupancies like a hotel or a motel. That kind of thing would fall into commercial. And then anything that's 4 stories or higher would be also covered by the commercial code. So when we talk about typical multifamily, kind of multifamily that might be built in Newton, that's in the most cases going to fall under the commercial code.
Thank you for that.
Thanks so much. Is there anything else, Anne, before I go to inspectional services?
Well, Ian, you said you were gonna delay talking about additions and alterations. Do you want to continue to delay that, or do you want to address that?
I'm happy to talk about it if you want. It is an area where we've seen a lot of questions and concerns from both code officials and home developers. And I'd say it's maybe the most substantial change between the residential stretch code of last year and the residential stretch code of this year.
I think the council would be very interested in hearing this. It is the essence of what I've been talking about with the inspectional services department and a few builders, to understand at what point additions and renovations trigger this code and what does it mean for the property owner.
Yeah. So, I mean, would it be okay if I share a single slide on this?
Yes.
Do that.
Can he still share? Yeah.
Okay, hopefully you're seeing a slide. You see it. Okay, so the first thing I would say is that the intent is that if somebody is living in their home and they want to alter it or make an addition to it, that in most cases that shouldn't trigger a HERS rating. And what happens today, but also what happened last year, if you have a modest size addition, is that for the pieces of the home or addition that you're building, they meet the minimum requirements in the base code, essentially. So if you're updating a window, your window meets the requirements for code. If you're putting in a new wall, then the insulation of that wall meets the minimum requirements and so on. The HERS rating, as we sort of discussed earlier, is a rating on the whole dwelling unit rather than just a component of it. So the intent of a HERS rating here is for situations where, let's say, a developer buys a modestly sized house and their intent is to greatly increase the size of that house and put it back on the market and therefore recover their costs and make some profit. So we see a lot of that in the metro area around Boston. People buy a 2,000 square foot house and then a year later put it on the market as a 4,000 square foot house. So the intent here is for those types of projects to require a HERS rating just like new construction would. The stretch code of last year had a HERS rating for those types of projects as optional, and in the HERS rating range of 65 to 75, depending on a couple of things. With the change in January, those HERS ratings come down to 52 or 55 or 58. And so it's a harder ask on the HERS rating, and it is required if your addition is over a certain size or if your alteration is over a certain size in the building. So to give an example of where that applies, if let's say you had a 4,000 square foot house in Newton and you wanted to add 1,500 square feet, then if that was an addition, that would trigger a HERS rating on the whole building. Now, if you were adding that 1,500 square feet as an in-law apartment, for example, then that is a standalone dwelling unit, and you can just do the HERS rating on that additional piece and not modify the existing house. If you're looking to take a 4,000 square foot house and make it a 5,500 square foot house, then the HERS rating would trigger on the whole house. And that is going to be challenging for some homeowners. It would require probably electrifying the heating replacing windows, doing significant insulation. Now, alterations to an existing house, that covers situations where maybe a house has a basement that's unconditioned and the owner wants to condition it. And in that situation, we would call that an alteration rather than an addition. And provided that alteration is less than 50% of the existing conditioned floor area, then it doesn't trigger the HERS rating. So if we have a 4,000 square foot house again, and the basement is 1,500 square feet, you can convert that basement into a conditioned space, and that would be over 1,000 square feet, but it wouldn't trigger the HERS rating. So there's a distinction there where you're not really adding to the footprint of the house. It doesn't necessarily trigger at 1,000 square feet. But when you're building an addition, then it does trigger at 1,000 square feet. So we've seen a couple of examples of this already in different communities. We've seen some workarounds already with people taking their addition from 1,200 square feet to 990 square feet. And that's okay. We recognize that that's what people want to do. But the intent really is to maybe make people think twice before adding 1,500 square feet to an existing home about the energy use of that existing home. And again, if they're long-term residents and they plan on staying there, then they can phase it. They could do 1,000 or 990 square feet this year, and then in a couple of years, they can come back and do it again. So they can incrementally build it. But a developer that's looking to purchase a home, renovate it quickly and put it back on the market, that wouldn't work for them. And so they would be required to do a HERS rating. So, and I see John Lojek on the screen, who I know is very knowledgeable on additions and renovations. So I'm wondering if there are any sort of follow-up questions on this topic while we're on it. Oh, and before, one last comment on this is, this slide's in blue because this is a stretch code change. And the specialized code doesn't do anything different on additions and alterations. So this is really already in effect for residential low-rise, and the only alternative to this would be going back to the base code. I think that's worth pointing out.
Thank you, Mr. Finlayson. Is that clear to everybody? Okay. I would like to move to John Lojek, Commissioner of Inspectional Services now. I haven't been able to talk to John because he's been out for a few weeks, and I'm glad to see him back. I have been talking with the temporary head of the department, Anthony Chickariello, hope I said that correctly, specifically to understand the impacts of the new stretch code on Newton as we were trying to understand what the differences are between the stretch and the specialized. And I got an earful of, and then we met with Ms. Berwick as well, issues around implementing the new code. That's not what's before us tonight, but it is relevant to our discussion about how we time the effective date of the specialized code if we want to adopt it. So I just wanted to summarize what I heard Mr. Finlayson say is that additions over 1,000 square feet or alterations that are both over 1,000 square feet and at least 50% of the gross floor area or the conditioned floor area, I'm sorry, of the home would trigger the lower HERS ratings or higher efficiency requirements for the whole building. But that accessory apartments, which I was glad to see, would not trigger requiring to retrofit the whole building. Just the new building would have to be, the new piece would have to be brought up to code. And you gave an example of a renovation that would not trigger it, being under 50% of the floor area. Still, that's what I heard ISD having the most difficulty with builders and tradespeople who are coming in for permits who were not aware that the code was changing in January. So with that, Commissioner Lojek, can you unmute, and would you like to talk to us about that, please?
Well, thank you, Chairman Crossley. I'll be very brief. We are getting up to speed on this, as you might imagine. I'd also like to thank Ian Finlayson for being here. Haven't seen you in quite some time. Ian and I were together when we went down to North Carolina to the ICC when we were the first adopters of the stretch code. So I've been involved with this kind of issues for a very long time. This is a large bite for us on the building side. As you can tell already, all of these things now are going to be parsed over and over and over again. We're already Anthony Ciccarello, who's also on the call, has been handling, because I left on vacation. He's been handling all these phone calls. I've been inundated since I've gotten back from builders and architects and developers about how this all applies. And we're honestly taking the time to try to educate ourselves how this all is going to work. So we'll see. I think there'll be a lot of adjustments as to how people do business in the building side. As they start to understand this, the limitations, the 1,000 square feet, the basement conditioned floor area, and so on. So that's what we see is what's going to happen here. We're trying very hard to make sure we understand all the rules, because there's nothing worse than explaining rules the wrong way. They're naturally, when these things come in, there's an awful lot of pushback. I would say that from our side, I would hope that the council would really consider the implementation period, as Ian has said already, that there's a delay from the time they vote it till the time they adopt it, because we've got all our inspectors have to be up on this. I do, and Anthony does, and so it's just one of those things where, in addition to all the other work we're doing every day, this is a big bite.
Thank you, Commissioner Lojek. Just if anyone has questions for you, you are cutting out every so often. I think we get the gist of what you. Everybody's nodding.
I think everyone is, Madam Chair. I think Ian was, and you are, and I think we're all cutting out. I'm not sure what the problem
not
is.
Not here. So it might be
online. We certainly were.
Okay, I'll find out if anyone else online feels like we're cutting out. It might be your computer, sir. We're streaming well here. You might just want to take a look, but the clerk had a good suggestion for you. If people have questions, you could eliminate your video so that you have more juice and just talk to us. But thank you for that. It is why I wanted to hear from ISD. And as being in the professions, I very much understand why a grace period is necessary for the construction industry and for staff to be able to prepare for new rules. So I have one more thing I just want to put on the table, and then there's questions from the council, and then I'll open the public hearing. But in the packet is a letter from Commissioner Morse, and I thought it was also important to hear from him, but he's all night at the DRC on Lincoln Elliott. And unless he is doing something and also on listening in, I hope you all read his letter in the packet. Essentially, what he's saying is the city's been preparing for this since 2018. So he's very confident that this is the direction the city is going in anyway, and that our buildings have all been being designed for electrification since 2018, and we are now opening buildings that are so designed. And he's not concerned about the code that it would, the parts of the code that would impact the municipal. So I think probably others who are going to speak tonight can speak to that if they choose to. I know there's a lot of folks from the Building Standards Committee of Green Newton who also sit on the DRC, so we'll see what they have to say. So in the room, I have Councillor Lipoff and President Albright who wish to speak.
Thank you. I just want to go on record saying that I would love to push the boundaries to go as green as we can, and I want to get on board. But I do have some questions. I have no problem with our public buildings. I have no problem with new construction. When you do something from scratch, it's a lot easier to reach these hurdles, and I'm all for that. My concern is with two by four construction in historic homes in Newton, when you are triggering greater than 1,000 square feet, and now you have to retrofit that home with narrow walls, trying to get to a HERS rating to comply with this, Mr. Finlayson, I'm wondering if you've done any cost estimations as to what this will do. I contend that this could hurt renovation along with addition in homes throughout Newton where people may not want to move forward because the cost of this may be out of control. I liken it a little bit to when I walked in to a store and saw a $16,000 plasma TV and said, I want to have that. But you know, I couldn't have it, but now I can pay $200 and have that TV. Technology often comes down to meet the market. 10 years ago, it wasn't efficient or financially reasonable to do a lot of these things, but now it is, and that's exciting. But I think as we move forward and push the boundaries, we do need to look at the cost of what this will do. In my estimation, new construction, bravo. But when we look at it existing, and I will also point to the fact that I don't know if it's a great thing for an agency that would like to do this to give the loophole to the homeowner to say, well, you can do 990 and then you can come back and do it again, which allows you to not comply with this stretch code. I think there's something wrong there that needs to be relooked at. But I've talked to some builders, my day job is in real estate, and others who really believe that this is going to make people not improve their properties because of the exceptional cost of meeting those HERS ratings in existing older properties. I'd love you to speak to that.
Before Mr. Finlayson answers you, just for everybody else, I want to make sure everybody understands that your question is pertaining to the stretch code that's already in effect. It is not pertaining to the specialized code, which doesn't change anything there. Is that? It's fine to ask the question. It's fine. No, it is what the stretch code is as of January 1st. That's already in effect. And it's a perfectly reasonable question. For everybody else, and who's listening, I want to make sure folks understand that we don't have a say over that. I appreciate the point, but that's not why we're here tonight. It just has to be said.
Additional takes it further?
No. So
let me hear from Mr. Finlayson.
Okay, Mr. Finlayson, go ahead.
Yeah, so just to sort of clarify that point, so the specialized code doesn't do anything to change additions or alterations And another thing that I think is relevant to this, any building that's a listed historic building or in a historic district, that also is exempt from all of the energy codes, so that because there are genuine challenges with preserving some of our finest historic buildings with the energy code, but then it's unlikely that you'd be permitted to add a 2,000 square foot addition to some of those historic homes either. So they've been living with these restrictions for some time. So I do think that the council is right to say that it will impact a lot of builders to that have been in the business of adding large additions or large renovations to existing homes. And we recognize that, and that's why we try to be upfront about saying that that's perhaps one of the biggest changes in the stretch code. It is also something that is impacting the energy use and emissions profile of our residential stock. So I don't think it's a loophole to say that if you make your addition an accessory dwelling unit, which essentially means that there needs to be a bedroom or more than one and a kitchen in that space, then you just need to make sure that that addition complies with the new code. We actually want to see more accessory dwelling units, I think. That's a little bit different than adding square footage to an existing home for the same family. And there again, we also think that for someone who's planning to be a long-term resident on that plot, if they want to expand the size of their house, then that's their prerogative. And that's why I raise what you maybe call a loophole of saying you can do that in 999 square foot increments. The intent here is that there's a significant part of the real estate market where small homes are being bought up by developers and flipped into big homes. And this does impact the affordability of communities because it takes small homes off the market for entry-level buyers who can't compete with sort of cash offers from developers. And then it's increasing the energy footprint of those homes. So a policy decision was made above my level that this was an important area to address. And I do think that for particularly the metro area around Boston and communities like Newton, this is going to affect a significant number of permits. And our hope is that it will change behavior a little bit on the part of builders and developers, and that many of them will figure out a way to do this in a way that maintains their business and their target audience. But it will, in doing so, it will have a significant impact on greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay, Mr. Finlayson, what I do want to point out is that you continually talk about builders and developers. This is about the residents of the city of Newton. It's not always a builder buying a home and putting an addition on, renovating and reselling. It's about our residents who live here, who have expanding families, who want to modernize a home. And speaking with the contractors, the architects that work with our citizens who do this for themselves, not for profit, as a developer does, that's where the concerns for the increased costs arise. I was hoping Mr. Lojek could have spoken to that. It's unfair. He's been on vacation. He just got back, and there's a lot of experience and information he's going to gather implementing, yes, the stretch code now, not the extension of this. But I would hope that when the state puts out a sweeping change, as this is, that feedback from the cities, from the building departments, as to the reasonableness in certain situations, I would hope, and I'd like to hear from you, that there's a period that you will be watching how this affects cities and towns, and maybe along the way there would be tweaks to some of the regulations. Is that a reasonable statement?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And thank you for the opportunity to talk about that. So, I mean, the language that proposed this change was made public in the end of June last year, and we did get over 800 public comments on that draft language before we finalized the code. But then it's not done. We anticipate having well, so we set up also in June. We set up a stretch code technical advisory committee that's staffed by code officials and national experts on energy and energy efficiency, and a couple of my colleagues at DOER. And we are looking to establish a sort of regular cadence of a public hearing every 6 months to hear suggestions on how we refine and improve the stretch code and the specialized code. In this case, we'd be talking about the stretch code. And I think, in the conversations that we've had in the last couple of months, this has been an area of a lot of discussion, and it's quite possible that we'll get proposals to amend this section. So yes, that is possible going forwards. Again, there was sort of a high-level policy decision that we have to think about existing buildings when they're renovated as well as new construction. But I think we want to get that balance right and not impact housing affordability at the same time.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you being here, and thank you for all the information, and I look forward to seeing how this evolves over time, and I'm grateful that there'll be some kind of look back or some kind of analysis along the way. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to urge my colleagues to, let's try not to do so much back and forth. We do have a public hearing after we have actually now a bunch of hands raised. So it's Councillor Albright, then Baker, then Laredo, then Wright.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being here, Mr. Finley. So my question has to do with, we have so many older homes in Newton, and we've been talking a lot about, for example, in our zoning code, creating what we're calling a Village Center Code 1 that's focused on the adaptive reuse of existing buildings, old Victorian homes, maybe turning some of them from single-family homes into multifamily homes, 3 units, 2, 3, 4 unit homes. And I'm wondering what the impact will be on those size homes of, well, we have the stretch code and now we have the specialized code. And I'm wondering if you've had experience in knowing, are people going to think, oh God, it's just cheaper to tear the building down and we can build something new, which would easily meet code, versus let me put the money into renovating a single-family house, an old single-family house, into a 3 or 4 unit multifamily house?
Go ahead.
May I respond?
Yes, please.
So, I mean, that's a great question, and one near and dear to my heart, because I'm talking to you from a 120-year-old Victorian house that was originally 2 units and is now 3 units. And when I bought this unit, it had a gas furnace and gas hot water and gas dryer and gas stove. And I converted it to a heat pump and induction stove and EV charging and all the things you might expect me to do. So I've been through this process, and I still have some original single glazed windows in my house because it's part of a historic district. So if I was able to change the windows, then I'm confident I would have got to the HERS rating required. I don't think it would make the HERS rating with the original windows, but again, as a historic building, I'm exempt from that. So as a policy goal, we absolutely want to see what you described, that people will preserve the fabric of and the character of neighborhoods, and at the same time maybe add a few dwelling units here or there where it makes sense. And I guess I'm living proof that it can be done and reasonably affordably. And I did it before there were mass save incentives or federal incentives or as much contractor interest as there is now in these kind of renovations. So
I just refine my question. I won't go back and forth a lot, but if a builder were to take an old historic, now this is not a historic it's not a landmarked house. It's not in a historic district. It's just an old house, an old Victorian. Would a developer find profit in changing that old historic house from a single family to a 3-family? I'm just hoping that you have some sense for whether they'd rather tear it down or try and renovate it.
Yeah, I mean, unless there's some fundamental problem, a cracked foundation or a moisture problem or a radon problem, I think that would be the only situation where it would make a lot of sense to demolish a building. I think it's almost always going to be more economically viable for the builder to keep the structure and maybe add modest additions to if there's space on the site, but to keep the core of the building. I think somebody like Mr. Lojek would have a better sense of how that's been done in Newton than I would. But in the community I live in and around, I think that's much more typical, that you would kind of build on what's already there in most cases.
Maybe we ought to ask our consultant to run the numbers for us and see is it still going to be cost effective to create these 3-unit houses?
As we're looking at zoning redesign.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
I agree
Mr.
with
Finley.
you. Thank you. I saw Councillor Baker up next. I don't see his hand right now. Are you there, Councillor Baker?
I am. I've been having some technical problems, so I'm just going to listen for a while.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right, then I think Councillor Laredo is next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, I agree wholeheartedly with Councillor Lipoff in regard to the difference between new and renovation/addition. I think it's just good public policy for any new construction, all new construction, to be all electric and meet all the best possible requirements we can, even if initially it costs a little more money. And I do expect in a lot of instances that will be true, but over the course of time, I think that's going to pay off. I, however, remain very concerned, as I think both Councillor Lipoff and President Albright said, about this cost of renovation versus tear down. So, Mr. Finlayson, have you or someone in your department actually done the cost analysis that Councillor Lipoff asked about?
Please go ahead, Mr. Finlayson.
So I mean, we haven't done a specific analysis of a tear down versus a renovation of an existing building. I think that would be interesting to do, but it's difficult to generalize. We could maybe take input on what types of scenarios it would be good to do that would be representative of. But I think we have, just to give you a sense, we had about 10,000 residential energy models run of different permutations of new construction. If you assume that homes, whether they're new or renovated, are going to have a desire for central air conditioning, then it's almost always cheaper to use a heat pump for that, because a heat pump is an air conditioner, but also a heating source. It's almost always cheaper to use a heat pump than to have an air conditioning system and then a separate heating system, whether that's fossil fuel or not fossil fuel. So there are some general dynamics, together with Mass Save now having a 1 to 4 family incentive that's significantly larger for all electric buildings, that are going to, and we saw this sort of over thousands of energy models, so it's generally true, but we haven't done specific examples,
I think,
that
Mr. Finley,
it's going to be cost effective to do this.
I don't think it's merely a matter of the cost of the system over time. That's not the issue. The cost to, as I think Councilor Lipoff was alluding to, is the cost to the homeowner to do the physical renovation that's involved. For example, if you're going to put in, say, an electric boiler where you have none, and you're going to have to rewire your house to accommodate that, that's a significant cost. And we don't want to discourage a tear down unnecessarily. So I'm going to respectfully urge the department to take a number of different scenarios and run the cost. A 1940 house, and you're going to do a 1,500 square foot addition, and you're going to have to put in an entire new system. And I don't quite understand with the HERS requirement there. You talked about your own property, and you're in a historic district, and it sounds like a gorgeous property, but you're not going to want to replace the windows. So in order to meet the new requirement, as a homeowner who wants to build the addition, at the same time going to face the task of replacing all the windows in her house and incur another $40,000, $50,000 on top of the project.
Yeah.
I'm gonna interject here, because we do have this, this does not require a public hearing, but we made this a public hearing so we could hear from a lot of different people in the industry who are prepared to speak, and some of them, Councilor Laredo, may be able to speak from actual on-the-ground experience to some of the points you and Councilor Lipoff are raising.
Chair Crosley, with all respect, I do think this is the person who is making, or the representative of the entity that's actually making the rules. And I think it's really important to hear what their perspective is, but I'll move on.
And I do think we've heard it. I'm not arguing with that. I want to move forward so we get to hear from folks who are actually working on this stuff on the ground. Also, I want to say again, for everybody's benefit, that we're talking about the stretch code that's in effect right now. We're not talking yet about the specialized code, which does not change this condition. And I just want to make that crystal clear to everyone who's listening too, I hear the issue. That's why I brought the Inspectional Services Department in and so forth. I get it. But I think we've made the point. If we could please move on.
May I ask two other simple questions?
Sure, fine.
Madam Chair.
Go ahead.
Mr. Finlayson, you used the term passive house before, and we in this council have heard on other occasions in the Land Use Committee, if I'm not mistaken in particular, that the definition of passive houses is rather amorphous right now. So could you tell us exactly what definition of passive house is being proposed here, and how someone would get certified to meet that they've met the passive house standard?
Sure, yeah, thank you for that question. So there are two different certification bodies currently. There's a group called PHIUS, or Passive House US, Passive House Institute US, and then PHI, which is the original Passive House International. They both have standards, and despite the name Passive House, those standards are applicable to any type of building, although the PHIUS standard is much more focused on residential uses. And so you would hire a Passive House certified raider or designer. And they, in the same way that with a HERS rating, you'd hire a HERS raider. And sometimes the same person is both a HERS raider and a Passive House raider. And they'll work with your architect or design team to ensure that the plans are going to be able to meet the certification, and they'll walk the design team through the requirements. But the basic requirements are based on peak heating loads and peak cooling loads, and then additional requirements like ventilation requirements, so that you're not building a heavily insulated box that's not a healthy building to be in. So Passive House is some of the healthiest buildings available.
So, Mr. Finlayson, does that mean under this proposed stretch code that a homeowner would have to get certified, or homeowner, I'm focusing primarily on a homeowner, but obviously commercial building as well, would have to get certified by one of these two bodies?
No, the homeowner doesn't get certified. The new building is what would get certified.
I'm sorry, forgive me, that was a poor question. So the building would get certified by one of these two bodies, would have to get certified by one of these two bodies?
Correct.
Okay.
And that can take some time, the certification process. So we've written the language so that provided that the builder has put together the documentation and submitted it for certification, they can get a certificate of occupancy and move in while they're waiting for that process to complete.
And what if the certification then is not approved? What happens then?
Well, typically what happens in that situation, which is extremely rare, is that it's in the builder or developer's interest to make what modifications are needed to comply. And I would say that in the permit submittal phase, you submit the plans that comply. So it's difficult to get too far down the project road without realizing there's a problem. And then we're really talking at the certificate of occupancy that you're documenting that building was built according to plans, much as you would with any other building.
So 2 points there.
But technically, if somebody failed to meet Passive House certification, but they met the code compliance documentation, then that would be okay from a code compliance perspective. It might be a disappointed buyer, but it wouldn't stop that building from being occupied.
I guess I'm a little confused there, and I won't ask because I know other people want to talk, but I'd certainly like at a later date to hear from Commissioner Lojak about this issue. And I'd also like to hear from the folks who came before us at I believe it was a land use meeting, if I'm not mistaken, who talked about the certification process and how it was not altogether clear. One other question, there's a requirement in the stretch code that one has to have solar panels of some kind?
It's only a requirement triggered by adding fossil fuels to new construction. So if, for example, you want to have a gas furnace in your house and your site is suitable for solar, then that would trigger a requirement for solar on that site.
Who makes the decision if the site's suitable for solar?
Yeah, so in the code language, we refer to a free national tool for assessing the solar window on a building, and the HERS rater or the building developer would be asked to use that for the roof area of the building to make that assessment, and then that would be submitted to the code official. So if someone's seeking an exemption, then they're eligible for that if the shading meets the criteria in the code. And there's a widely used free tool that enables that assessment. And it's not a complicated tool. I'm able to use it. I'm sure other folks would be able to use it to verify that if there was concerns about it.
I have other questions, but I want to be fair and not monopolize your time. Thank you very much. I very much appreciate your responsiveness and
Thank you, Councilor Laredo. I'm going to go to Anthony Chickariello because he has his hand raised and maybe he can shed some light on some of what's just been discussed. Mr. Chickariello, can you unmute and speak? Mr. Chickariello?
I'm in.
There you go. I saw your hand, so I thought you might be wanting to address one of these issues.
Yes, Chairman Crossley. I wanted to touch on what Councilor Lipoff had talked about as far as how the new stretch code that we're dealing with now has a HERS rating of 52 for level 3 alterations or alterations of more than 50% of the home. And I wanted to ask Ian, and correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't, in the new specialized code, doesn't that HERS rating of 52 go to 42? Am I right with that? I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's a simple one. So for additions and alterations, it would stay at 52 and not go to 42.
It does not. Okay. That was my question.
Oh,
thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that. Okay, I have Councilor Wright and then Councilor Markowitz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A couple quick questions. I want to follow up with Councilor Laredo. I want to see if I understand it. So for passive house, in order to meet passive house, it's a certification of the documentation for that house. And then it's up to ISD to confirm that it was built to that documentation. Is that basically it?
So, I mean, ISD does all the normal inspections that they would do, whether it's the base code or the stretch code, whether it's HERS or passive house. With passive house, though, there has to be a separate third-party passive house certifier who's showing that, you know, with the passive house approved software, that the house is going to meet those targets, and then that the test results show that it met that. So it's sort of
so they'll
it's like a belt and suspenders approach.
Okay, so they will come on site and actually do some tests in the house.
Yes, that's required.
Okay, good. And also with previous counselors, I'm also concerned that this will incentivize tear downs instead of renovating our older homes in the village center. So finding out about that data, that would be great. Then you talked about listed historic homes that are exempt from it. What is meant by listed? I mean, we have landmarking, we have National Registry of Historic Homes, which is separate. What do you mean by listed?
Yeah, so I mean, the code language sort of spells it out, and I won't read it to you, but essentially, if a building is eligible to qualify as historic, either through federal or state or as part of a historic district, then then the energy code, whether it's a stretch code or a base code, is optional. And essentially, if you want to opt out of the energy code, the onus is on the developer to show that it would require changing the historic fabric of the building to comply. But that's fairly straightforward with, say, wanting to preserve 2x4 walls or wanting to preserve windows or so on. So that isn't being changed by this stretch code update or the specialized code. That's sort of well-established language that's been in place for a long time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Wright. Councilor Markowitz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have a question. I hope it's within the scope of this, but I just wanted, as you spoke through, I share the concern, by the way, on the retrofitting and the impact of that. And I think thinking through and modeling that somehow is definitely appropriate. We've got a lot of examples of that in Newton, a lot of things coming through land use that I think would be good tests of that. But I want to talk a little bit about what I'll call small apartment building. So that could be something that's 6 or 8 units, but it could be something that's, say, 16 units as well. And we have a number of those in Newton. If someone was renovating a structure such as that, I guess it's a two-part question. If they didn't really change the footprint, maybe it's three-part because I got to think about whether the basement's included in that or not. But if they didn't change the footprint, but the renovation was more extensive than 1,000 feet, say it's a 10,000, 12,000 square foot building, would they then come under the stretch code for compliance as of now?
Yeah, so it depends a little bit on whether it's renovating under the low-rise residential code, so 3 stories or less. There, the threshold is
This would probably be more, just to move it along. This would probably be more than 2 stories in most cases.
More than 3 stories.
Maybe more than 3. Yeah, let's talk to that level just to.
Yeah, so for 4 stories and above in the commercial code, then under 20,000 square feet, which 20,000 square feet would capture, say, up to 10-unit apartments. Then there wouldn't really be a significant change. You're following the prescriptive pathway and you're upgrading the features of the building that you're changing. So if you're putting in a new window, that window complies. It doesn't trigger a whole building.
Or just remodeling the kitchens and the baths,
Right, exactly. That's sort of typical work. And then above 20,000 square feet, then you would move to either HERS or TEDI or passive house.
Now, is that the renovation was of 20,000 square feet, or it could be a 1,000-foot renovation in a 20,000 square foot building?
Yeah, so if the size of the renovation is under 20,000 square feet, then it wouldn't trigger that whole building assessment.
Okay.
So that sort of work, which is common, would proceed more or less as it has in the past, with modest changes in the prescriptive code.
Yeah, I would think there's a lot of that. Certainly, we have a lot of 70s, and maybe I don't know if it's a lot's the correct word, but we have a number of buildings built in the era of, say, they're 50 years old now, and I would suspect that they're going, if they haven't already, they're going to be due for renovations. And I think this is something that's going to come up, is the whole, what's the appropriate way to incent the renovation to comply if possible, but at the same time not making it so onerous that, again, you might even tear those buildings down to say the heck with it, it's not worth the renovation. And we'd probably want to avoid that, I think. But it's something that certainly runs through my mind, and I think I've heard that from not so much builders, but people who own property that falls into that category. So something paying attention to. Again, I think in Newton we have, not only is that we have a number of those, they also for us represent probably somewhat what I would call naturally affordable stock. 2-bedroom apartments that's rent for $22,000, $2,100, $2,200, which falls within the right AMI range, and in Newton is actually pretty affordable. So I'd be concerned that we somehow make those now no longer viable from an investment and management standpoint, and incent them to be replaced by something else. So just something to consider as we work through these examples. But great presentation, by the way. It's very helpful. I hope we can get a copy. I'm assuming we'll get a copy of that.
You will get a copy. Absolutely.
Well, I'll just say this, Chair, going out to vote tonight, looking at that, I don't know about everybody else, but I like reading tables, but there's definitely some data to digest there, just to make sure that you understand what you're voting for, as whether or not you're for it, but just to fully comprehend what the extent of it is. I think these questions are very helpful, though, in clarifying some of that.
I appreciate that, and I want to say I'm thinking about this as everyone is speaking. We haven't even gotten to the public hearing yet. And I recognize that this, as hard as we tried to put everything we needed into the packet in order to address the specific issue that we have, most folks are still talking about the stretch code. And if we're going to vote for the specialized code, we need to be able to focus on the distinction between the stretch code, which is law now today, and the specialized code. So I'm going to suggest, I have one more question from Councillor Baker, and then I'm going to suggest we go to the public hearing where statements and questions are all appropriate, and then come back into Committee of the Whole to see where we stand. Councillor Baker.
So I just want to ask that very question you're raising, Chair Crosley, is that in the difference between the existing stretch code and the proposed code for an historic structure or an historic district, is there any? I'm just trying to understand what we're asked to consider as a change as opposed
I
to
believe
what's
what
there
Mr.
now.
Finlayson already said, and it is in the documentation, is that buildings that are landmarked or within historic districts are exempt from these rules. Can you confirm that,
But
please,
that's
Mr.
the new
Finlayson?
rule or the old? That's what I'm just trying to clarify. I think that's correct.
Yeah, so that's correct. That's the old rule and the new rule. It's
Yeah,
unchanged.
so that's not a change. That's just maintenance of what. That's not a change that this is causing. I just want to be clear on that. Okay, thank you.
Yep, thank you. Okay, I do not see any other hands up. Is that correct, Carol? Thank you. Could members of the public who wish to speak or who believe you want to speak, I see hands are starting to go up, could you put your hands up all at once so I can get a sense of how many? Just going to give you a few more seconds. You folks know how to put their hands up. There's a little raise hand in the bar at the bottom. I see more people are adding on. Okay, that's not so many. Even if a couple more people add on, how about we give everybody 3 minutes? You'll be getting a sound when you're about 30 seconds from your 3 minutes. I'll be reasonable in terms of letting you complete your thought and so forth. And why don't we just go down the list? The first speaker is Jonathan Cantor, and I have to recognize that 13 years ago, he and I were co-chairs of the High Performance Building Coalition, which predated the Building Standards Committee of Green Newton. So he was here 13 years ago, and we were organizing a similar hearing, although I would say the subject matter today is more complex. Mr. Cantor, can you unmute, and would you like to begin?
Sure, I think I'm unmuted.
Yep.
I'm not sure if my video is on because I don't see any way to control it.
Don't see you, but we hear you.
Anyways, I don't have any way on my screen to put my video on, so I'm not sure how that is. But at any rate, I did have a statement prepared, but I really wanted to, of course, recognize the significance of this. As Deb said, 13, 14 years ago, we were embarking on the initial stretch code along with Ian Finlayson, who's made a fantastic presentation tonight. And in a very momentous event, we persuaded the council at the time to not only learn and understand the stretch code, but also to approve it in one meeting, which was really terrific. And I consider that actually a harder task than what's before us tonight, mainly because the opt-in stretch code really isn't much of a stretch, particularly on the residential side. On the residential side, the HERS scores are staying pretty similar. And yeah, there's things you can do, or it is doing, to encourage folks to, go to all electric versus to have fossil fuels. And that's really, it's almost a consumer protection feature, because we all know that we need to electrify our building stock. And so if people are building a new house and putting in gas, they're actually making a pretty poor investment. So we need to help them out and really figure out how to go all electric. And the HERS scores show that. And so if you do the specialized code for most residences, you're talking about a 6-month change in schedule, potentially starting the specialized code in January 1st instead of July 1st, 2024. And that's That's pretty much the real big difference as I see it. We've talked a lot about additions and major renovations. And again, I think people are overly concerned about this. For alterations, you have to both be renovating 1,000 square feet or more, and that has to represent 50% of the existing building. And when you're doing that kind of renovation on a house, you're probably changing all the electrical, you're probably changing the HVAC system, you're probably doing a whole host of things that, regardless of what stretch code version we're talking about,
30
that
seconds.
that are going to make this building, ready for sale, and so or to live in, and so the HERS ratings are just going to ensure that we're putting our best foot forward. So I don't think it's a big deal. I think people will be going down that road, and now they just have to performance test, and it's the same situation we were dealing with back in 2009, where people had to all of a sudden test the performance of their building, and I don't want this whole issue to obscure our main purpose here, which is to hopefully adopt very shortly the specialized code, the opt-in specialized code. I think that sends a really important signal to everyone. It's consistent with all of the things we're doing in Newton, with its 10 community pilot program that we're hopefully going to be able to join for fossil-free construction in Newton, the Birdo program, Newton's commitment to be net zero by 2050. All of these are part of this specialized opt-in code, and I think it's really important that we adopt it. And I'm happy to take questions either during this or after it about costs and feasibility and all of that. I think a lot of people's concerns can be addressed.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thanks.
I thank you so much, and thank you for offering to take questions. Just for anybody who doesn't know, Jonathan Kantar owns Sage Builders, and he is one of the folks who's out there doing this kind of thing already on homes in Newton. The next speaker is Betsy Harper.
Hi, I'm Betsy Harper. I don't have video going.
Oh,
Okay.
Ms. Harper, could you please state your address? I forgot to ask
I know, I
Jonathan.
was just looking at that video stuff. Yes, I live at 19 Fairmont Avenue in Newtonville. And I'm going to be the face of that ugly developer who's done a tear down, as well as a homeowner of a Victorian 130-year-old house where I'm doing a renovation. Deb actually asked me to just go through my qualifications. I've sort of thrown myself all into this world in the last 5 years, partly because I live in a very leaky Victorian. So I went back to school. I'm a self-taught certified passive house builder now. I'm the treasurer of the statewide Passive House Massachusetts Advisory Board. We did look at and gave feedback to DOER back in June 2021. So it's not something that's shocking and new to people who have actually worked on it and studied it. I'm an active member of the Green Newton Building Standards Committee. I am a developer, and I have built a beautiful passive house Victorian in Cambridge that was a teardown. And as I said, I didn't want to, but I'm now doing a renovation. I'm a Victorian. Just let me say quickly that in the teardown, I took a mold-infested, squirrel-infested 1,800 square foot house that was an energy hog, and I built a passive house that is a HERS rating of -13. That means the solar panels on the south roof produce more energy than the ultra load energy requirement for the house. That energy load is far, far less than what the original energy hog of the old house was. And so the cost is definitely higher, but in terms of having a much larger, that was a 4,000 square foot home. And in terms of having a much larger home, it does not have to be higher energy use than what it is replacing. So move to the renovation quickly. I did not want to renovate this house. I wanted to get out of it and downsize. My kids have moved out, and my husband and I know that this house is too big for us, even though we have an accessory apartment on the top floor. In any case, we looked at a lot of houses that have been renovated, and I was shocked and dismayed about the poor quality of the renovations that have been done in some of these Victorian homes. And my word to the industry is get out there and get educated. I don't really have very much sympathy for the builders who have not made use of all the education that we now know about building science, all the education that we now know how to use high performance building materials. And we decided that we had to stay in this house and be stewards of this house and renovate it right before we could then pass it on to somebody who needed the space that we have that's too big for us. So we might be crazy,
30
but
seconds.
you know, I was self-taught and this isn't that hard. And I'm really, really not sympathetic with the builders in Newton who are in general, not Sage Construction, but in general, not building to the highest quality that they could and that they could get reimbursed for in the high prices that Newton carries. I guess I care. I'm a little passionate.
Thank you very much, Ms. Harper. You're right on time. All set. I will move to Lizbeth Heyer. Please state your name and address and go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Lizbeth Heyer, and I live at 25 Freeman Street in Auburndale. And I am a member of the Newton Housing Partnership, but I'm actually not speaking on behalf of the partnership tonight because we haven't really discussed this issue. I'm speaking on behalf of a multifamily developer that I work for, Two Life Communities, that builds supportive housing for low-income seniors. And I wanted to sort of raise a concern and a question about this, actually. And I want to start by saying that Two Life is very committed to this. This is a really important step, and I'm talking very specifically about this specialized code. We're already in many of our projects that we're working on in Greater Boston using passive house standards, and I think the move to passive house is really an increasingly viable one and one that should be embraced, both at the building cost level. It's not that much more expensive to go to passive house, and it certainly helps on the utility side. So the issue that I wanted to raise as a concern and question is in the component of the specialized code that talks about mixed fuel buildings, and I'm particularly focused on large multifamily, and I think this is extremely relevant and important because of the in particular, the MBTA Communities Act and the need to focus on how we're going to get to a greater level of density to be in compliance with that. And it's going to take these larger multifamily buildings. So, and my concern question is very focused on the aspect of pre-wiring as it relates to mixed fuel. And you know, the challenge that Two Life has had, and our buildings are almost all electric except for domestic hot water. And, you know, the challenge is that the technology for domestic hot water that's sufficient for a large multifamily building is still really cutting edge. You know, even as recent as 6 months ago, when we were working on design for several projects, it wasn't possible to do domestic hot water with an electric source. The technology is just not available. I'm gathering that is starting to change. I'd like to hear more about that actually from anybody that has information on where that technology is going. But pre-wiring seems like a reasonable solution while we're still in the early stages of being able to comply on the domestic hot water side. But pre-wiring is not that simple. The devil is really in the details on these things. And pre-wiring and
30
getting the
seconds.
actual wiring right is really difficult when we don't know what that equipment's going to be, or what loads will be required, for instance. So I definitely think we need to go in this direction, but I'm concerned about the ability to affordably, and I'm particularly focused on the affordable housing aspect of this, and not overburdening projects that are already really complicated. So I'll stop there. I again really feel like we need to move in this direction, but I want us to be really cautious about
Thank you.
not making it difficult for multifamily to comply when the technology's just not quite there.
Thank you, Ms. Heyer. I see that Mr. Finlayson has his hand up, and before I'm guessing he can address your concern. You're not the only person who has expressed this concern with domestic hot water. A fellow named Dante Capace was unable to be here tonight, and he was going to write in, but I guess he didn't have time to do that. But he expressed that concern to me. So I'm guessing you mean the difference between, say, a high-efficiency heat pump electric generated domestic hot water versus gas or resistance heating, which is more expensive. So I'm going to recognize Mr. Finlayson.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so first of all, I appreciate the question from Elizabeth, and just for context, I started my career in Boston working for an affordable housing developer called the Community Builders that's based in Boston, but we were working in 10 states on the Eastern Seaboard when I was there. So I definitely have a lot of empathy for and value for affordable housing. And we do recognize that domestic hot water in a multifamily building, particularly an affordable housing building, is not a simple thing to solve for. We have been talking to different manufacturers around the industry about where they are with their supply chain and their products, because these solutions for domestic hot water do exist, and they are more mature in other markets outside the US Northeast. But it's a question of getting the supply and the contractors and installers that are comfortable using it in our market. So there's a low-tech solution, which was hinted at already, which we see a lot in markets like New York City, with just electric resistance water heating, or a combination of electric resistance water heating and heat pumps in a two-stage system. But we recognize that there may still be projects that want to start with gas, specifically for water heating in multifamily, and then convert in the future. And that's specifically why we allow for that mixed fuel pathway and then the pre-wiring. And just to very briefly talk about pre-wiring, there in the commercial code, which multifamily of the nature you're talking about would fall under, we have two options. One is to wire to where the existing fossil fuel water heating unit is with an appropriate amperage wire. And the other is to show like a custom design for how you would replace gas water heating, because you may not want to do a like-for-like swap. You may want to go to a different domestic hot water solution. So that flexibility is built into the specialized code language. So we are expecting to see the market convert to full electrification pretty quickly, but in the short term, we want to make it flexible to allow for gas water heating. And I think this will come up if Newton is considering the 10 community fossil fuel free pilot as an issue that I would flag for discussion there as well.
Thank you, Mr. Finlayson. I'm going to move on, but when we finish with the public hearing, I'd like Ms. Berwick to speak to the relationship between what we're considering here and the 10 Communities program that many of us have been very enthusiastic about participating in, but there are some conditions now. So next is Beverly Craig. And Beverly has sent the clerk's office some 3 slides to illustrate her points. I'm going to let her introduce yourself. Could you begin, Ms. Craig, by not only your name and address, but where you work and why you have, I mean, the background you have in this field?
Sure, thank you. My name is Beverly Craig. I live at 9 Arlington Street in Newton Corner. And my position during the day is with Ian's sister agency, the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. And I know cost, in considering the specialized opt-in, this move to passive house for multifamily, cost is a big issue. And so, are the slides available? So I can't speak to cost to all categories of buildings, but back in 2016, the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center did give grants for 7 affordable housing developments to take their existing plans and to upgrade them to passive house and to track the incremental costs associated with those. And you can see on this slide that those range from smaller properties, multifamily, like 30 units, all the way to 135 units. And on average, the incremental cost has been 2.4%. There's been a lot learned in this process about best practices for reducing the incremental cost. One of the major ones being that the experience and training for design and construction teams is very important. The more experience folks had doing this, the less expensive. And that's sort of consistent with high performance construction in general. Another lesson is sort of that simple massing and roofs are definitely less expensive. Next slide, please. The other thing, I think Ian mentioned that quite a few projects are moving towards passive house. And I will say in the Mass Save program, I was just checking with them, of the 164 multifamilies that are taking advantage of the passive house incentive, 73 of those, or almost 45%, are affordable housing. And actually, when you look at the ones that have actually done the design work and gotten that pre-certified, so it's like been approved by the certifying agencies, that's actually up to about 60% of the projects. We did learn, like, so what are the bigger differences in cost in these kinds of multifamily buildings? Ventilation, which I think Ian mentioned, is one of the biggest ones. You do end up providing a lot more fresh air to the rooms instead of just one to the entire unit. And this additional testing and verification where you have somebody, sort of a third party, going and checking to make sure it's actually being built the way it's designed. We did find across all these projects that significantly savings were on the heating and cooling equipment because the envelope is so much better. And next slide, please. And then I think a lot of people have a little concern that will, like, a standard like passive house actually deliver? And when we look at places like Boston, they have building energy disclosure, and so you can actually compare, right? So that's what this chart is right here. One building, the distillery, which is passive house, 28 units, is in the green on the far left. And that building is using 63% less than the median of all the other ones. And this is consistent when we look at other building disclosure ordinance areas. So 5 passive house buildings in Philadelphia, when we look in New York, when we look in New Hampshire. So just wanted to mention, this is only really related to that category of building and going to the specialized opt-in code, but just wanted to make sure and share that information.
Actually, I was going to hope you could keep that slide on for just a minute. Thank you, Ms. Craig. I just want to make sure I understand you're comparing a passive house or the 7 passive house projects to a large range of other projects that are not passive house over a similar time period, and you're showing the dramatic reduction in emissions and energy use. Is that correct?
Yeah, so in Boston, you have to disclose how much energy you're using per square foot. And so these bars are all the different buildings in Boston that are the same age and size that were built since 2008. This building up in the right corner, the distillery, is the green on the very left-hand side. So you can see it's like half of most of those buildings.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very helpful. Okay. Let's see. We have Helena Brown is next.
Thank you very much, Councillor Crossley, for giving me this opportunity. I will stick to my allotted time. So I am Helena Brown. I live at 56 Cloverdale Road in Newton Highlands. I am a retired academic. I've been a professor of environmental science and policy for over 30 years before retiring at Clark University. And in the last 5 years, I've been the chairperson of the Newton Citizens Commission on Energy. And among our accomplishments that are related to the topic of today was the 2019 Citizens Climate Action Plan. So what I would like to say is that I strongly support the adoption of the specialized stretch code in Newton, and I especially appreciate the link that, well, both the updated stretch code and now the specialized stretch code are making between the size of a house and its required energy performance, specifically Hertz rating. This is not news coming from me. I have spoken before this in this chamber before, raising repeatedly my concerns about the increasing average size of newly constructed and existing renovated homes in Newton. The energy demand of larger space, of course, is greater than the smaller. If you were to compare two houses built the same type, built the same at the same time, all things being equal, except that one is twice the size of the other, the larger house is going to use somewhere between 50 and 60% more energy for heating and cooling, approximately, depends on the architecture, than the smaller house. So it is really a concern. And so I'm highlighting these two features. One is that houses over 4,000 square feet that are heated with fossil fuels must meet zero Hertz rating by a combination of measures. I think it's a very good feature. Now that's in a specialized stretch code. And in the regular stretch code, the requirement that 1,000 square feet addition requires Hertz rating for the entire house, not just the addition. And now I totally understand and relate to the concerns raised by Mr. Lipov and Mr. Loreto and many others, I'm sure, about the cost, additional cost to homeowners.
30 seconds.
Say all they want is to enlarge the living space for various personal reasons. But on the other hand, let's think about this. I don't really see how else Newton can meet its targets on greenhouse gas emissions that have been unanimously approved by this city council when it adopted Climate Action Plan in 2019. Progress on meeting these targets in the residential sectors have been minimal, if any at all. And in fact, we are falling further and further behind the targets we set for ourselves. And so we must recognize that a bigger house will require more energy, and the only thing we can do is offset that increased demand by electrification and by better insulation and such measures.
Ms. Brown, can you wrap up, please?
Yes, this is my last sentence. On a personal note, we have electrified our home, heating, water heating, and electric vehicle. And I was surprised, I have to say, how relatively inexpensive it was. I won't go into the numbers, but it really surprised me. So it's good news for homeowners that Must Save is subsidizing on such a large scale this project. Thank you again for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Ms. Brown. And there's one more speaker with his hand raised. If there are any more speakers, please raise your hand. Jay Walter.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Jay Walter. I live at 83 Pembroke Street, and I would like to keep us focused on what's before us tonight, which is basically adapting the specialized code. What we are being asked to do is adapt this code, which would really accelerate the schedule of stricter performance standards, basically for commercial buildings. And I would urge the council to adopt the specialized code. We need it to meet our energy goals. But just to address the concerns that have been expressed by other councilors in the chamber concerning the impact on homeowners. As most of you know, I'm a residential architect. My work is additions, alterations, restorations of historic homes, almost exclusively in Newton. So I took a look at my project list, and as far as the new stretch code standards, only 30% of my projects would be affected by this by the newer, stricter standards for alterations and additions. And of that 30%, 2/3 were already doing whole house renovations where they would be upgrading the entire building anyway. So I guess what I'm saying is the market is there. Most homeowners who are building additions to their existing homes wouldn't be affected by this. And those that are undertaking larger renovations or restorations of their homes are willing to go the extra mile to make sure their houses are efficient. And lastly, I'd like to say that we all express concern and a desire to preserve our existing housing stock. But if we are committed to that, then we also have to commit to a path of making that housing stock perform to the new standards of energy efficiency that are required in this new world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Walter. I'm not seeing any more hands. I am seeing one. We have one audience member here this evening who, oh yes. Oh, okay, there's two more hands, but I'm going to, okay, I'll recognize the folks online first. I'm being waved off, okay. I see Kathy Pillsbury and then Mary Lee Belleville.
Hello, my name's Kathy Pillsbury. I live at 34 Carver Road.
It's hard to hear you, Ms. Pillsbury, and you...
Does this sound better?
Much better, thank you.
Okay. I live at 34 Carver Road, Newton Highlands. I strongly support the specialized energy code, but I just want to speak just briefly about my experience in my house, and which is about 130 years old. And last winter we had a mass save audit. We've had them periodically, and they've significantly changed what they were able to do in terms of recommendations for our house. So we insulated our house, and it was actually much less expensive because of all the rebates that were available. And it has made the house significantly cooler over the summer, and it's warmer in the winter. So I think the cost of upgrading even a Victorian like this is not as high as imagined, given all the possible rebates. That's it. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Ms. Belleville. Mary Lee Belleville.
Okay. Thank you. I think I'm unmuted now. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. I think I have a question and a couple comments. I just wandered into this to get myself educated, and I was surprised to learn that this was a public hearing. So I'm curious how this was noticed.
In the required way, and also we made it's in the packet, and it is the required way being notices have to go out 2 weeks in advance and 1 week in advance in newspapers. And then also we made a special effort to email to members of the building industry who we have listed on file in both inspectional services and the planning department, which is a long list.
Yep, and you have a good representation of the building industry. I'm just curious how the general public would have known that this was going to be discussed.
It's on our electronic posting board, and we have all these materials in the packet. So
they would have to go there to find it.
Yes.
Okay.
Like everything else. Yep.
No, well, most public hearings are noticed in a different way, but that's fine. But to call this a public hearing.
Excuse me, can you tell me what way that is?
We get if I'm noticed of a public hearing of something that's impacted me in my neighborhood, it comes to my mailbox.
That's completely different. This is something that impacts the entire state. Building code is adopted every 3 years, and amendments happen periodically in between those times, and those aren't noticed at all. This is being noticed because we have the ability to adopt another piece of the code.
Sure, and I won't quibble with that. And I think the goal of a public hearing is to make sure we hear from the public. But what I'm hearing is we're hearing from advocates. And I feel like there should be an effort, because I've heard a lot of things tonight that were interesting to me that I didn't know. And I think the goal should be to make sure that the Newton residents know of what the implications are. So it just seems to call this a public hearing when all we've heard from are advocates is.
I'm sorry, Ms. Belleville, but we've heard from people who have concerns about the new codes because it impacts them in their work. And, I think we're hearing from everyone who cares to participate in this topic.
Well, everyone who cares doesn't know.
You're going to be, I'm not sure what your point is, but if you have comments to make, you're using up your 3 minutes.
I think others know what my point is, so I'm going to stop. Thank you.
Okay, you had a little more time.
Oh,
is there anyone else? I see a couple hands are still up, so I think if you've already spoken, they should come down. Okay. I'm going to bring this back into, I'm sorry. We have the one member of our audience who would like to speak, Mr. Kent Gonzalez. Would you say your name and address and affiliation, I think would be appropriate.
Sure. My name is Kent Gonzalez. I'm with Northland Investment Corporation on Washington Street here in Newton. Some of you may know that we're doing a little project over on Needham Street. You may have heard about it, the Northland Newton Development Project. But what you may not know about it is, as we started this journey, way back in 2018 and 2019, we committed to, with the help of Betsy and Bev and Jay and Dan Rubin at Green Newton, we committed to 3 passive house buildings as part of our special permit. What you may not know is that's expanded to where we're doing 9 buildings. So 764 of our units are going to be in a passive house building, making it, according to our consultants, the largest market rate all-electric passive house project in the world. We just like to say in the country. But I think that's something that Newton needs to know, and hopefully they're proud of. And I think it's also, and I always have this conversation with Bev, and she has that wonderful slide, about how things are not that much more expensive, but they are. But that doesn't matter because if we're not doing this, it's what's the expense on our communities as we go forward. So and I think to the extent that you adopt the opt-in specialized code, which we would comply with, I think that really doesn't go far enough. And Ian, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, because Paul Armand, an associate, a colleague of Ian, in a presentation yesterday, and I've seen this before, and you may have seen it as well, by the year 2050, 80% of the buildings that exist today will still be here. And that means those 80% of those buildings, if they aren't upgraded, really the 20% of the new buildings, like our buildings, really aren't going to matter that much to climate change. It's really the existing stock that needs to be addressed and improved. I don't know how. A little bit of it will happen through these alteration requirements, but it's really how do you get to that homeowner that needs help to upgrade their home, and really that's really where the impact is going to happen. So really, I'm just wanted to let you know that this is really where I think we need to be headed. So,
Mr. Gonzalez, if I may, since you stood up to speak, the question came in earlier about domestic hot water facilities in multifamily housing, and we heard one tonight, and as I said, I've heard it from others who are concerned about that technology. I know you're in the early stages of your project, but you've certainly looked into this.
we're not in the early stages anymore. We're pretty much in the later stages, honestly. I mean, there is work going on the site right now. If those of you have been by, there's a lot of underground utility work and site work that we have to do on the property, so that's underway. But we're also experiencing the turmoil in the construction industry that everybody else is, so struggling with costs that are just incredibly high that we couldn't have anticipated, so we're pivoting and trying to deal with all of that. But we committed to all electric probably in 2020. So we had evaluated doing heat pump hot water heaters. They take a lot of space, they are noisy in an environment like what we're trying to create. We looked at centralizing hot water and distributing it, but that's really not that efficient. So we were able to make old-fashioned electric resistant, high efficiency hot water heaters work in our system and meet the passive house requirements. We have one building that's pre-certified right now, another one that should be hopefully pre-certified in the next hopefully a couple of weeks, and then three others that should be following up. So we were able to make that work. Now, at the time we were doing the analysis, gas was actually an easier and more efficient way to address energy, but because of the other aspects of the project that we were incorporating, we were able to make the energy efficiency work with the electric resistant, decentralized. Everybody has their own hot water heater.
Thank you, appreciate that. Okay, I would entertain a motion to close the public hearing unless you want to begin the conversation first and think about it for a while. We have a motion from Councilor Ryan to close the public hearing. So all on the committee who are online, if you could please raise your electronic hands, and everyone in the room, please say aye. Aye. Any? Yes, please. This is a committee. That's why I said the Zoning and Planning Committee. Oh, members of the committee, I'm sorry. I thought I prefaced the online and then never mind. Was continuing the reference. And so I see from the online, I don't see Councilor Baker's hand. I see 7 in favor of closing the public hearing. Councilor Baker, are you still with us? I know he was having some trouble. He's off. Okay, so we have 7 in favor, none opposed. Everyone can please take their hands down, unless you have something you would like now to say. I'm seeing Councilor Krinsman. Councilor Krinsman? Oh, I'm not sure what he said, but I'm guessing that he just had his hand still up. Yes, Councilor Albright, President Albright.
I would love to say that to make a motion to accept this, but I was looking through all the materials and I didn't see an exact chart of what exactly the specialized code upgrades and what stays the same. And that's why I asked the question I asked. I was clearly confused. I thought there was a change for small buildings, but there isn't apparently.
No, I'm going to try and say this, but then I would love Mr. Finlayson. I think he did have a chart.
He did, but
So-
there's no chart in our materials.
No, there's not very much on the chart, but I think we should go back to it. But as we understood it when I was working with Ms. Berwick, and the summary of the stretch code is in here that does have it, and there is actually a chart, but there's a lot of information. So there's a lot of pieces of the stretch code, and then the very just couple of pieces of the specialized code. So there's two things. One is a time issue. So the stretch code, and we should not call the specialized code the specialized stretch code, just to try to not be confusing. The stretch code that's in effect now has much stricter values than last year, but then by July of 2024, it becomes stricter again. So it's already written, it's already in the law, but there's a 1.5 year delay. So basically, the idea is your HERS ratings for small residential are whatever they are now. I see the slide is up here. And then they get, by July of 2024, you can see they're at HERS 45 or HERS 42, depending on whether they're all electric or mixed fuel. But now they're 55 and 52, I think. Ian, you can clarify that. So in my mind, if we wanted to adopt the specialized code, you can see where the change is. The change is for multifamily 4 stories and above. That's the change, because by the time you get to July of 2024, the specialized code and the stretch code require the same thing for low-rise residential, 1 and 2 family townhouses, et cetera, and things under 3 stories, up to 3 stories. So the change is relatively de minimis. If council wanted to entertain delaying the implementation, let's say you want to implement it because you want to do it for the sake of our meeting the terms of our climate action plan, but you don't want to advance the stricter ratings beyond the stretch code, then you might consider adopting it in July of 2020, making it effective in July of 2024, not in January of 2024. And this is completely up to us. It's completely up to us when we want to make it effective if we choose to adopt it. Those are just the recommended dates because they align with other code, Massachusetts code amendment effective dates. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Should I call on Mr. Finlayson to explain more about the difference between the multifamily stretch and the...
Yes, that would help a lot.
Okay, Mr. Finlayson, can you do that? Can you explain in, sort of simple terms, please, the difference between the requirements of the stretch code as of July 2024 and the specialized code for multifamily 4 stories and above?
Sure, and I'm wondering if I can share screen again.
Your screen is shared. We have a chart
Right.
on here now.
Yeah, so I have 2 slides. This slide covers residential buildings, and then there's another slide on commercial buildings, and they look similar. But yeah, I think you summarized it quite well. So for all electric low-rise buildings, there's no change. For additions and renovations or historically, there's no change. So the changes are for mixed fuel buildings. where we would require solar on new mixed fuel low-rise buildings if they have a suitable solar window. So if there's solar access on the site, that would mean it would be a good investment to put solar there. And where there are fossil fuel uses, such as water heating, that they have wiring in place to convert to heat pump water heating or electric resistance water heating in the future. And then on the multifamily side, in the regular stretch code, HERS is an option. The new Teddy path is also an option.
Can you explain what that
is?
is?
An option.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I'm interjecting, but can you, I don't think anybody here or very few people know what Teddy is.
Yes. So I don't want to give you a half-hour summary, but I'll give you the Cliff Notes version. So the Teddy pathway, which is already used in places like Vancouver and more recently Toronto in Canada, is a simplified energy model that's focusing on how much heating and cooling is needed for the building type. So you can think of it as a simpler version of Passive House and a slightly less stringent version of Passive House. So in the regular stretch code, we allow 3 choices for multifamily, whereas in the specialized code, once you're above 4 stories, we require the Passive House standards, either the international one or the US one, to be followed. That is more energy efficient than the other 2 options. And then again, if there are fossil fuel uses in the multifamily building, then we require wiring in place for converting in future. So that's the residential comparison. And then I'm just going to go very quickly to the commercial comparison. And so here we divide up schools, offices, and municipal buildings, where that same Teddy pathway is a common option. And you'll see that in the specialized code, again, it's no different for electric buildings. And the difference is where there is fossil fuel being used, let's say in a police station, then there would have to be wiring in place to convert that in future. And again, if there's a good solar window on the roof, then there would be a minimum solar requirement. And then the same thing for other commercial uses. So let's say a lab building or a hospital or a restaurant building. Again, it's the changes are a solar requirement. Unless the building is Passive House, there we don't require solar if you go Passive House with your hospital, let's say, and the wiring for future electrification. So that's the straightforward summary of the differences between the 2.
Councillor Albright, is that helping you?
I wish I were smarter in the building professions. That's all I have to say.
We will have all of these charts. So I understand this because I've been working with Ms. Berwick, who I'm going to call on next to explain something else, but I can't tell you how many times she complained isn't the right word, but
That's the right word.
Explained to me how this is not her wheelhouse, and I caught myself saying a few times, well, then it's great that you're digging into this, because if you can explain it, other people who are not in the building professions can perhaps, you'll be helping them understand what it is. But code is very dense. I mean, if it helps anybody, and tell me if it doesn't, but I mean, the Massachusetts building code is this thick, and it's in small type. The 1 and 2 family code is thinner, but it's, because 1 and 2 family code is a whole separate piece, so that 1 and 2 family homes can be built, builders can just refer to one code. But I'll also say that, and maybe Mr. Ciccarello or Mr. Lojek, if he's still here, would want to comment. One thing that's nice about the energy codes, since we've had energy codes, is there's also a requirement to have checklists in the inspectional services department that have to be filled out by the builder or the architect, and then it's sort of, you don't review every single aspect of the code. Fire and safety predominate. The energy code is really a very separate thing that gets reviewed, but it's tedious stuff. There's no question. I'm looking at this from the point of view of big picture, why is this a good idea? But what or not. Councilor Leary?
Thank you, Madam Chair. What I'm getting out of this really is the specialized code really kicks in with a mixed fuel building. All electric, there's not that much change. And if it's mixed fuel, they're requiring wiring for all electric for future and for solar. And so to me, that's really incentivizing all electric buildings and reducing the carbon footprint for the homes that are mixed fuel. So it seems to me like the specialized code is a very good idea and we should adopt it.
Thank you. Before I call on folks who now have their hands raised online, I would like to invite Ms. Berwick to speak briefly to the one-page memo she has put in the package that relates this code to 10 communities in particular, because it really doesn't relate to Birdo. But Ms. Berwick, can you summarize that for us so that everybody hears what we've just really learned the requirements for 10 communities?
Yes, sure. Thanks for the opportunity. So before I get to that really quickly, just let me say, echo what I know Jay Walter said and what Councilor Crossley has said, which is a lot of this, most of this conversation tonight has been about the stretch code that is already in place. And the specialized code doesn't add all that much to it. I want to say that say something about just really quickly about the importance of progressive building codes, because what they do really is they incentivize energy efficiency and a move towards electrification. And we're not going to get to net zero by 2050, which is Newton's intention, unless we do those things, incentivize energy efficiency and electrification. That said, although building codes are extremely important, I think grace periods are perfectly appropriate. I don't know that I have been asked to opine on that, but you know, it's important that we have progressive building codes. Whether they go into effect now or 6 months from now or is much less important. So, but now let me get to the point about the relationship to the codes and the 10 communities program. So you'll remember that the city filed a home rule petition, as did a number of other cities and towns, asking to be given home rule authority to require new construction, substantial renovation to be all electric. Instead of acting on those home rule petitions, what the legislature did is they passed, as part of a larger climate statute, a provision saying that the first 10 communities to have filed home rule petitions of this nature can participate in a pilot program that effectively gives them the authority to require new construction, substantial renovations to be all electric. There are some caveats to that legislation, and here's what they are. One is that to participate in the 10 communities program, laboratories and medical facilities, including hospitals, have to be excluded. Another provision, you know, by definition really, is that new construction, substantial renovations have to be all electric. That is, cooking can't be excluded. those are sort of the big picture. That's the big picture legislative overview of the 10 Communities program. In addition, DOER has promulgated rules governing the 10 Communities program. And those include some interesting points that DOER recommends, and they recommend it because they don't have authority to require, statutory authority to require it, that we adopt, that Newton and the other 9 cities and towns adopt what DOER is promulgating as a model code. And that model code is, as I said, going to require that cooking not be excluded. It does provide that cities and towns can propose certain exemptions. For example, it's clear that emergency backup power will be permitted. I expect that our exemptions in our home rule petition for outdoor heating and cooking will also be exempted. But there's one other really important point in the context of the discussion we're having tonight that I need to make, which is to participate in the to participate in the 10 Communities Act, we have to adopt, effectively, what DOER is saying is we have to adopt the specialized code. Again, they're recommending it, but it's clear that's the only way this can move forward. Because if we don't adopt the specialized code, then there are going to be some fossil fuel pathways that are permissible. And though those don't work under the 10 Communities program, which requires all new construction to be electrified. One other point on this, which is that for the 10 communities, there will be kind of a variant of the specialized code, which is to say that any fossil fuel opportunities that are provided under the specialized code won't be available for the specialized code in the 10 communities. So backing up to sort of the major points here is, if we want, as indeed our home rule petition indicated that we did want, to require new construction to be electric, we essentially have to adopt the specialized code. It will be a specialized code that is slightly different from the code that you've been hearing about tonight, meaning that it will not permit any fossil fuel pathways. Obviously, if you're going to participate in an all-electric pilot program, you have to require all electric, no fossil fuel pathways. So I just want to emphasize that, in effect, if we continue to want what we said we wanted in our home rule petition, which is to have the authority to require new construction to be all electric, we have to adopt the specialized code.
Thank you. I'm going to add one more thing to that, because when you recall the other evening when you told me when we had to adopt it by, I was a bit startled, which is we have to adopt it unless you look into this and it's changed. The language reads that we would have to adopt it by September 1st.
Well, let me clarify that, and maybe Ian can be helpful.
Okay.
My understanding of what DOER is saying is that we have to indicate to DOER our intention to participate in the 10 Communities program. So Ian, maybe you can shed light on whether that means we will actually have to have adopted the specialized code by that point.
Yes, please, because when you said that to me the other night, I couldn't imagine how we could do that, but please.
I do want to add one point that that I know you were dubious about when I said it, and I'm going to say it again despite that, is that by September 1st, we do have to have an ordinance that has been approved by the city council, but that won't go into effect until, but that it is only being proposed to DOER. So at the city level, it's approved, not proposed, but it's being proposed to DOER. as of September 1st.
So approved subject to DOER's approval and without an implementation date.
Exactly.
Which sounded very confusing to me, but I suppose we can talk that through. Mr. Finlayson?
Yeah, so essentially what DOER is looking for is application from the 10 communities stating what your plan is for participation and how you would, your timeline and your process, whether you choose to use DOER's model language or not is up to you. But as Anne pointed out, I don't know if it's impossible, but it's much easier to implement the pilot in coordination with the specialized code than any other pathway. And we tried to design the 10 communities regulations to make that the most streamlined view, just because I think it's easier for the code user and the developer community.
Understand. Thank you. I have a counselor in the room who would like to speak, and then a bunch online. Counselor Kalis?
Okay, so I think there's been some really good explanation tonight, and but I do feel like people could be really confused, especially with what was just presented about the 10 communities. So just to kind of, what I'm getting from this is that to be part of the 10 communities, we have to adopt a specialized code.
Essentially.
Essentially, and that's it. There's the timing, there's cooking gas, there's everything else, but we have to adopt a specialized code. And tonight, the only decision is really on the specialized code. And, if to implement it, when. What was so enlightening was kind of the presentation that you and your explanation, Chair Crossley, when you kind of walked through the grid, and it made it very clear that we're already on the path with a stretch code to be very close to the specialized code. It's just a matter of more, I'm simplifying, but a little bit more electrification and moving the timeline up.
Potentially.
Essentially.
Potentially.
Right. And that's what I'm trying to, it's the general concepts that I'm trying to make sure that we all are getting across. To me, we should do this. And it's about speed. It's about we as a council have already committed to our goals, and the commitment to the specialized code. Yes, it does raise the bar, but it's not as scary as I actually thought it was when I was walking in here. And I think that we can do it. So that's
all
what
right.
I would say.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the simplification, which I think maybe is helpful, especially at this hour. So there's a lot of folks, starting with Councillor Wright and then Laredo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So in general, I'm supportive of this, but the details I'm concerned about. And I'm not sure if I'm ready to vote for it today. First off, I thought to be part of the 10%, the 10 communities program, we have to meet our 10% SHI, which with Dunstan East coming off, it'll be years before we get to that point. So I thought we're going to get kicked off that program because there's a few other towns and cities that want to get on to that program. Is that correct?
No, we do. You're right that we have to meet the 10B, the 40B, one of the 40B 10% requirement or one of the other housing affordability requirements. But the planning department is telling me that they expect that we will.
Well, they thought that we were going to get to it in the fall, but then Dunstan East came off and that's delayed, and the units won't come back on until they do vertical construction. So they got to do the basements and stuff first, and then it's one building at a time, and that's 300 units. So it'll only come on 100 units at a time. So a couple of months ago, planning thought it was, but in my perspective, it looks like it might be a couple of years before we make our 10%.
Councilor Wright, you may be correct. We have to watch the industry really carefully, as you heard from Mr. Gonzalez tonight. And as any of us have been hearing from any of the developers of any of the projects across the city, the industry is very volatile right now. So it could be delayed. I'm still hearing that what it looks like we could make the grade this summer. But, you're right, there's some uncertainty here.
Okay. And my next question, which I have a lot of concern about, is to meet some of these, people have to meet passive house. And we don't have a clear checklist or something of passive house. Now, I've been talking to one builder in Newton, and he has projects from 6 units to about 40 units. He has 4 or 5 going on right now. And he doesn't want to do passive house because it's going to cost him $150 to $200 per square foot beyond his cost, which I think was kind of ridiculous, especially if you're doing new. But going to all those land use meetings and stuff like that, it's not really clear when, I'm going to meet passive house or I'm going to do passive house. But that whole certification process and what needs to be done and things like that, I don't see it as being clear. And I don't even know ISD if they're clear on the passive house and
I'm not sure if anyone from ISD is still here, but let me say a couple of things.
Mr. Lojak's here.
Okay, well, I'll let him come in after I say a couple things. One is, so in my profession, I'm seeing trainings for passive house certification for years now. They're out there. So the industry is ramping up. And what that means is you have a third party, and as you've heard, there's a third party certification requirement. That's like a lot of things that ISD reviews. They don't actually have to review the particulars of what's required in the, to meet passive house. They want that third party certification. They want a third-party licensed surveyor. They want a third-party licensed structural engineer to provide an affidavit for the structural design, that sort of thing. There's a lot that ISD, there's a lot of work that ISD does that requires third-party certifications, and that is in lieu of them having to do that work. So that's how I see that working, as we heard from Ms. Harper, and I've heard in the past from Ms. Beverly Craig also, that well, I'm going to put it this way, and Mr. Finlayson can weigh in on this too, because he actually said this, but when we first took up the stretch code, and I was actually not an alderman at the time, I was an advocate, but there weren't enough HERS raters. And the stretch code itself requires HERS raters. That's the third-party certification. You need that HERS rating, and the Inspectional Services Department does not do that. They just want the piece of paper, know that the test has been done and stamped and certified. And there weren't enough HERS raters at the time, but there were a lot of training programs out there. So there's a bit of a chicken and egg kind of thing going on. But if Mr. Lojek wants to speak to this, if he's listening, please just chime in.
Well, Madam Chair, if the question is, do we do all these things? No, we don't. Much of our job in many aspects of construction is to collect the paperwork. There's control construction on buildings of a certain size, all kinds of certifications of different systems and equipment. And this is no different. The HERS rate is supplied with the information that they have done their testing, they fill in the forms, and they supply them to us. So our job is to check the checkers, as it were, on many projects, and especially in these specialized areas, such as the energy code and things like that. The same practice goes throughout the industry, concrete, steel, all those kinds of things. And this will just be another area where we are collecting information from the people who are certified or licensed and are doing their job and supplying us with the information that says that it has passed the test, as it were.
Thank you very much for that. Does that help, Councilor Wright?
A little bit, but then, you know, I'm getting big pushback from these developers saying it's, you know, it's going to add $150, $200 a square foot to their project.
I have no doubt somebody said that to you, but it's not, I don't know what that means. I mean, I don't know what their square foot cost for their project is. And that's sounds
they're doing
enormous.
A lot of projects in Newton right now. And so I try to direct them to people who know more about this and to get more knowledge and training. And this developer says, I'm doing passive house in 1 or 2 of his projects, but I'm concerned it doesn't sound like he really knows what he's doing.
Well, that may be too. But you know,
and like I said, he's doing a bunch of projects in Newton right now.
We have an amazing group of people in our community. We're so lucky to have the Building Standards Committee of Green Newton. It's a dozen folks who have an amazing combination of expertise, and they've been really interested in and have been talking to developers and have impacted the course of much development already in Newton. I would think, I don't know who you're talking about. We don't need to share names at this point, but that would be where I would go.
Well, and I have been directing him to there, but I can't make him go there.
Oh,
so
okay.
I have been giving him information and emails and phone numbers and names.
Okay.
I still have a lot of questions. I like this, but I'm not sure if I'm ready to vote on it tonight. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Councilor Wright. Councilor Baker, I think you're next. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I have to look at the list, not just the faces. It's Councilor Bowman is next, then Councilor Baker.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. So you had me at, this is what we need to pass in order to move forward with the 10 communities. I think that's a critical piece of the next step for us as a city. And so I'm prepared to vote on this if that's what we need to do in order to move forward on the 10 communities. I think we've heard from several other counselors tonight. Tonight's been very helpful. So I'd also just thank Mr. Finlayson for coming and sharing his knowledge, but learning tonight about how much is already in the stretch code. So this isn't adopting the specialized stretch code isn't that much more. I'm glad we worked out because I was thinking about the pathway for the 2 fuels and how that would work with the 10 communities. And if adopting the specialized code allows us to more quickly require higher standards prior to the implementation of the 10 communities, I think that's really important. And just one question for clarification. These new codes apply to any buildings that have been permitted, but not, that have been approved by city council. So like a special permit process approved by special council, special permit, but have not been permitted by ISD, correct?
Yes. The codes come into play when the builder seeks her permit. Whatever's in play on that date is how the codes are reviewed. Okay. So one of the problems, if I can just, I know folks, are very concerned about some of the stuff in the stretch code. What Mr. Ciccarelli said to me is that a lot of the smaller builders who might have started and gotten a demolition permit last year and not come in for their building permits until this year for small projects, or just doing a house, or one of those large additions or a gut renovation, which is what the level 3 is about, got caught in the middle and had to go back to the drawing board to comply with the the better insulation codes and so forth. Yeah, and I just want to say we're not voting in committee of the whole tonight. This is a zoning and planning committee. Yeah. Whether or not we vote to recommend this to full council for Monday. So, for Tuesday. I'm sorry, it's not Monday. It's Tuesday.
Point of order, Madam Chair.
Yes.
are you taking a vote as committee of the whole or?
No,
as
I just said that. The vote tonight is Zoning and Planning Committee deciding whether or not to recommend this to full council for Monday. This is a committee of the whole so that we could share all of this information with the council, because as we can all see, it's rather complex and not the kind of thing we should be discussing in that level of detail in full council. So we thought it was important to invite everyone to this meeting.
Madam Chair, may I help?
Yes,
Because
please.
there's been it's a terminology mix-up, I think. So this item was referred to ZAP. For an item to be officially a committee of the whole, it has to be referred to the committee of the whole, and it has to be put on second call and voted. This item was referred to ZAP. So
Correct.
it's technically not a committee of the whole. It's technically, what it really should have been advertised as is a meeting of ZAP with the full council invited.
Oh.
Yes, because
okay.
committee of the whole means something very special in our rules.
All right.
So
Then I won't comment this evening. I'll save any comments to when we take this up at full council. Thank you.
All right. You're welcome to comment, though. It might help us. So I just, okay, thank you for clarifying my inadequate clarification. I'm going to go next to Councillor Baker, and then Danberg, and then Downs.
So thank you, Madam Chair. I had some technical problems and I'm still having some, so I may have missed parts of this. But here's my question. When I had something similar to President Albright's, trying to understand the impact predominantly on the residential sector of going to the stretch code, the special code versus the stretch code. And there are several aspects that I hope we could get clarified. Ms. Berwick talked about, in her memo, talked about the home rule petition had some differences or exceptions she thought were going to be okay, but I wasn't clear whether they were or not. She alluded to one, which is exterior heating, cooking, I think. There are a couple of others, but the point I'm getting at is that I don't know how the 10 communities piece now works with this, and that may need to be clarified by Monday.
I think you may have missed the clarification that Ms. Berwick gave, but what...
no, I heard the clarification, but
oh,
it
you
wasn't
did
clear
hear
enough to me. Yeah, no, I'm just saying. Well, let me tell.
Well, let me take
put out my question.
Okay, you have several questions, so...
Yeah, I got several, and maybe they can be solved.
Can we separate your questions? Can we separate your questions?
Just don't interrupt me for a minute. Let me get my questions out, and then you can talk about how you want to deal with them. Is that all right?
I thought, okay, go
so
ahead.
I've got a question about the 10 communities. I've also got a question about the chart that was part of the presentation, but not in our packet, that Councillor Albright talked about and was shown. And unfortunately, I can't see it very well because I'm on a phone rather than a computer. But there is a provision that is trying to make the distinction between the stretch and the special code, as I understand it, in mixed fuel buildings, particularly residential. And as I remember looking at that, there is a provision that says that they have to be wired for solar and unless shaded. And I didn't hear, and it may have been said earlier, what the criteria for shading. We've heard a lot about tree cover and canopy and things like that, and what the impact of that is going to be. So what I'm trying to understand is the incremental difference between the stretch code as is coming online and the special code for the residential property that is not going to be all electric, and what the impact on a particular property owner might be. And also because of the question about how solar works, the context of shading and what that means. So those are the two questions, and you can take them in whichever.
Okay, it seems like there's several questions, although two are very closely related. The one question about what constitutes a site that is appropriate for solar was answered by Mr. Finlayson earlier. in terms of a formula and a standard that's applied, that's written into the code that I think he said was too complex to read to us. He didn't think he should read it to us, but that there are actual standards that tell you whether or not your site is possible and appropriate for the application of solar. But
does that mean the tree is there or not? We've been talking in other contexts about trees, you know?
He didn't want to get into the particulars. Mr. Finlayson I'm sure there's many more things besides trees, but Mr. Finlayson, can you try to provide a simple answer to that piece of the question?
Yes, I think I can. So if a site is shaded, whether it's by trees or by adjacent buildings or really anything, we're neutral on what is causing the shading. But then you use a free tool called PV Watts to show that that site is shaded, and then you're exempt from the minimum solar requirements.
So you're not creating an incentive to cut trees down. That's all I'm trying to understand as part of this.
No,
if they're there, they're there. That's it.
If anything,
okay.
We want an incentive to keep mature trees on the lot. So
okay, yeah, I just wasn't clear how that worked. So appreciate the clarification. And so let me just go back to Ms. Berwick's point. As I heard her, she did not feel that there were exemptions in the home rule petition that she felt would be okay under this specialized code. Is that correct, Ms. Berwick? Am I hearing you right?
No, I don't think so. I think that, and I apologize if I've been garbled, but what DOER, and we have DOER here, so Ian can correct whatever I say, but what DOER has said in webinars and other conversations is that exemptions will be permissible, but they haven't specified exactly what exemptions. We know by statute that laboratories and medical facilities are exempted. In Newton's home rule petition, we had a number of other exemptions. From conversations with DOER, I believe that our exemptions for outdoor heating and cooking that isn't connected to the building infrastructure will be permissible exemptions. Our other exemptions had to do with emergency and standby backup power. I believe those will be permitted. Then we had an exemption for Newton Wellesley Hospital. Now medical facilities are exempted by statute. So that only leaves one other exemption in our home rule petition. And that was for hot water, centralized hot water systems in large buildings. And I think that's a moving target. Ian, tell me if I'm correct that hasn't all been worked out yet.
So you're correct in everything you've said, and as it pertains to domestic hot water, we've proposed in draft regulations that be phased out over time. So for the first several years, it would be permitted, and then it sunsets. And we received public comment on that, so we're now reviewing the public comment, and we'll put together final regulations. I think sometime this spring, perhaps as soon as March, that sort of clarify that.
But just to clarify, what's a large building, Ms. Berwick? Because that's not a residential, that's a commercial structure. Is that right?
Well, it might be residential. It would have to be, I think the exemption, excuse me, in our home rule petition, I'm honestly not sure. Ian, do you know how it defines? If you give me a minute, I'll look.
I'm not familiar with Newton's home rule petition.
Yeah.
But I think we were envisioning an exemption for multifamily and large commercial building hot water systems, not so much single family.
So the single family would be unaffected. Is that what I'm hearing? Pretty much you're really trying to capture the big one. Okay. Yeah. All right. Thank you. Those are my questions, Madam Chair. Thank you very much.
Okay. I think I want to add one thing to that. I don't know if it was clear, Councillor Baker, that you remember our home rule petition did exempt gas cooking. We were going to allow it in single family, 1 and 2 family residential, and the 10 communities program requires cooking to be electric. So that's something, of course, that's not what we're doing tonight, but it is related. So, you know, we are going to have a separate conversation about 10 communities and how to go forward with that.
Okay, so the new code that we're talking about, the extra, I'm sorry, not because stretch sounds like it's the new one, but it isn't. We're talking about the special code. Doesn't address that all electric cooking requirement, correct?
Correct.
Okay, thanks.
But the 10 communities program would eliminate the use of gas cooking.
So again, that's something for that discussion, I think. Understanding that to move forward on 10 communities, we would need to adopt a specialized code. And I believe all 4 communities who have adopted the specialized code, you know, like right away, and who did right away in January, are also part of the 10 communities program. Just as an aside. Okay, let's see, how are we doing here? Councillor Danberg, and then Downs, and then Lucas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a question on what Ms. Berwick just brought up, and that is if she would just further clarify for me so that I'm clear on the requirement under the 10 communities pilot in regards to single family gas cooking for existing single families and for new construction.
Yeah, yes, sure. So the 10 communities program only applies, excuse me, to new construction and substantial renovations. It does not apply to existing homes.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. That clarifies it for me. And for several years under this program, we would exempt domestic hot water in commercial or large residential, and that would then phase out after a few years, and we would require it. Is that the case?
That's what Ian is saying. Their draft regulations say.
Okay. So Newton has already adopted its climate plan, and we have the intention of getting to net zero carbon by 2050. In order to do that, we have some serious work ahead of us. Have 10 communities opted in? In other words, is there still room to get into this 10 communities?
We are one of the 10 communities unless we don't meet the rule, unless we don't meet the conditions.
I see. Okay. It seems to me that from all that I've heard, and I've learned a great deal tonight. Thank you very much, Mr. Finlayson, and everyone else who has explained this to us. It's been very helpful. That it has been a bigger leap for us to 13 years ago, I believe it was now, to have adopted the stretch code, which we did, I believe, if I remember correctly, Chairman Crossley, unanimously in one night. Did we do that?
Yes, I remember. It was a highlight of my day and probably year.
Yes, as it was for me too. So the industry also has had a number of years to ramp up. This is not something that is brand new to the industry. They've been looking at this and educating themselves. They're the industry is in a different place today than it was 13 years ago. And so, given all of these things, I am ready to vote for this. I understand that some of my colleagues still have questions, but I think that this is something very important for us to do, and I'm ready to adopt it because I don't think it's that big a leap at all from the stretch code that we now have that we are under. So I would vote yes if we took it up tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Danberg. Councillor Downs is next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've been listening very carefully to a very interesting discussion and reading the background material. And I think Councillor Kalis and Councillor Danberg put things fairly succinctly. If we want to be one of the 10 communities, we need to pass the not just the extended stretch, but the specialized code. No?
The stretch code is already in effect.
No, I mean oh, right.
Just
so
the specialized. We have only one.
The other one we already have adopted because we adopted the first one. So to me, it doesn't seem like a big step from one to the other since it mostly affects very large buildings and new construction. And I would urge the committee to take a vote tonight and to pass it so that we can get moving.
Thank you, Councillor Downs and Councillor Lucas, and then President Albright.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. So let me I've been listening all night, been trying to follow this conversation, and I honestly thought we were in committee of the whole. Maybe that was my misunderstanding of our rules, but I want to thank President Albright for explaining it a few minutes ago. But I want to go back to something that Mr. Finlayson, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, sorry. Something that you said earlier about the historic districts. Did you say that they are exempt from the specialized code? Did I hear that correct?
Yes, they're exempt from all energy codes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, that's helpful. And if we pass the specialized code, it goes into effect on January 2024, is that correct?
That is for us to decide. We could decide to make it effective January 2024. That would be the earliest we ought to make it effective because of how other amendments to the building code are made and so that there's a grace period for the industry to prepare. But we could decide to do it later than that, but you want to do it on 6-month intervals. So the next time would be July of 2024, which is when the new stretch code that's already in effect actually gets stricter. That's already written into the code. So it's our decision, but there's some precedent for aligning with the Massachusetts Building Code Amendment calendar and giving time to the industry.
Okay, so forgive me, Madam Chair, let me see if I am following this. So we can, if we vote on it in ZAP tonight, and then next Tuesday on the full council, we have the option of essentially opting in on January 1st or July 2024. So forgive me, what is the rush to vote on it in February or March so quick if it doesn't go into effect in January?
We want to make a statement to the industry as soon as we can so they can have time to prepare. At the beginning of this meeting, after Mr. Finlayson gave his initial presentation, we heard from Commissioner Lojek, and I mentioned that I'd been speaking with Anthony Ciccarello in the meantime to hear. So the stretch code that's in effect now has been advertised for a very long time, but there wasn't what's called a grace period, which they used to call, I don't want to be confusing, but they used to call it concurrency, where you could pick the new code or the old code for a period of 6 months. It was all about getting the industry prepared and getting our department prepared for the new code. So the date, we don't want to adopt it as I think, we could, but I don't think it's a good idea that we adopt it any sooner than January of 2024, because code amendments go into effect either in July or in January at the state level. It just makes it, it just aligns it with a process people are familiar with. So is there a rush? No, there's not a rush, but it's just to try to make that statement and allow people to, as much time as possible to, who are in the industry, to kind of catch up.
So we pass it now, let's just say now, we give them, what's that, 10 months to get up to speed for January 2024? Is that essentially what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I got some reading to do this weekend. That's all I have for now.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Lucas. President Albright, I think. Oh, no, it was Councilor Leary. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. This has been a great conversation. I've learned a lot. And taking this all, I just remember the Public Facilities Committee, how much time we spent on pushing for all electric buildings as part of our climate action plan, and that we were highly involved in the filing of the home rule petition to allow the city the authority to require all electric buildings for major renovations and new builds. And now the adoption of the specialized code is a prerequisite for us to participate in the 10 Communities program. And what I learned tonight is that really the specialized code is only slightly more stringent than in what is already in the stretch code, which is already in effect. And it's really not going to make that much difference, especially for homes smaller than 4,000 square feet. And for the larger homes, it's going to require on-site solar sufficient to offset fossil fuels, and they have to be pre-wired. It seems to me that it's also incentivizing the building of homes 4,000, under 4,000 square feet. To me, this is a real dream vote. This is what we've worked for a long, long time, and it's crucial to our climate action plan and to actually meet our goals, which, as Dr. Brown mentioned, we are falling behind with residential. So I would really urge that the Zoning and Planning Committee vote yes tonight, and that we adopt it by January 2024, and that we recommend to the full council that we move ahead with this really important vote.
Thank you, Councilor Leary. Is that a motion?
A motion to approve, yes.
All right, thank you. The motion is on the floor, but we do have Councilor Baker who would like to speak. And then Councilor Krinsman.
So, Mike, thank you, Madam Chair. I want to ask, did the chair have a recommendation as to the grace period? I mean, you said we could adopt it effective as of January 1st or July, but I don't think I heard a recommendation.
Well, I'm not sure that it's my role to recommend, but I would recommend certainly that we not make it any sooner than January 1st of 2024. I do want to make I want to make sure everyone understands that if we make it effective January 1st, 2024, then the stricter values in the stretch code become effective then also. Not to be confusing, but the stricter values of the stretch code otherwise would only become effective in July of 2024. So that de minimis difference between the stretch code that we are a stretch code community and the specialized code happens in July of 2024.
Well, my recommendation, not recommendation, but I guess my sense is that because people have anticipated, at least the default is that July of 2024, if we're going to make the specialized code effective, it might make sense to make it effective at that time rather than accelerate the other sooner than people might have expected it. So, and so I think that if there's a committee recommendation, it seems to me the better recommendation would be to have it in July as the effective date, just to make sure that that doesn't create an unanticipated consequence for people of adopting something which, as people have pointed out, is a minor part, but has a major effect in accelerating the full impact of the updated stretch code. But I don't know how my colleagues feel.
Okay, I think we need to take two separate votes. One is a vote of the committee to recommend that we adopt. Well, that's the motion that's on the floor, that recommend to the council that we adopt the specialized code. The second is, I think we need to take a straw vote on what our recommendation is for the timing of when it becomes effective. That's
okay.
Okay.
Yeah. And if I could just be heard one.
Sure. Oh, we lost
main item then, which is that I want to. Yeah, I'm having trouble with the gadget. Sorry, but I'm going to abstain on the main motion. I'm disposed to vote for the specialized code, but I want to just understand a little more about some of the questions I'd asked, and so that's why I will abstain. But I'm sympathetic to it, and on Tuesday I may be ready to vote for it. And then I want to be heard on the timing question later. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much.
Madam Chair, did you forget about me?
Oh, did I? Okay, I'm sorry. President Albright, and then Councillor Krinsman has his hand up too.
So Councillor Leary beat me to the punch, but I'm happy to speak to you know, we've heard a lot outside of this meeting from people in Newton that are worried about the costs of the stretch code, and will perhaps be even more worried about the costs of the specialized code. But as I sit here tonight and I think about the climate action goals plan that we as a council voted unanimously for, and I think about the fact that we wanted to be part of the 10 communities, we voted unanimously to be part of the 10 communities. So I'm balancing the cost that people are worried about and maybe some complaining about against the cost of not doing this, of not implementing our goals as we said we would in the plan. So it will be painful. I have no doubt that it will be painful getting there. That I know that many of the folks who spoke tonight said, oh, it doesn't cost that much more. But for some people, costing a little bit more is a lot more. So there will be some pain involved, but I think it's absolutely the right thing to do. So I will be voting for this motion.
Thank you, President Albright. Sorry, I lost track of the order. Getting a little tired. It's kind of late. Yeah, Councillor Krinsman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't know who the president thinks she is jumping ahead of me, but that's okay. I appreciate the motion. I was going to ask the clarifying question that Councillor Baker asked as well about the timing, but I will simply take this opportunity to say that I support the motion. I am very appreciative of all the information that was provided this evening and the questions that were answered, very patiently, I might add. I appreciate the time of Mr. Finlayson coming from DOER to talk to us. It feels like some of the topics were brought up time and time again, but hopefully folks have a good understanding now of what the actual impact of this would be, what the actual difference from what is set to go into, or what is going into effect anyway, and what changes we would be making. My preference, as Councillor Baker said, would be to opt for the July 1st implementation date. I think that makes the most sense. And I want to go on record in support of this, especially because if we take this up Tuesday night, I will not be present. So I'd like to say that I'm in support of this. I'll be supporting the motion in ZAP before the committee of the whole.
Thank you so much, Councilor Krinsman. So you meant, of course, July of 2024.
Correct, July of 2024. Well, the only options are January 1st or July, both 2024, right?
Well, those are the better options. We actually have the authority to make it effective anytime we choose. I just thought, you know, aligning with the building code and calendar would be a good idea.
Yeah.
And
July 1st,
DOER
2024.
recommends that. So, great. Thank you so much. So we have a motion to approve from Councilor Leary in zoning and planning. So if you are online, would you raise your hand if you approve the motion? And Councilor Baker, if you're abstaining, you might want to lower your hand.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. And any others on the committee? I think I see Councilor Danberg and Councilor Wright on the committee. If you approve the motion, please raise your hand. And in chambers, that's all of us who are left are on the committee. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 So we have 6 in favor, and do we have abstentions?
Abstaining.
I'm 2, yeah.
Okay, so Councilor Baker and Councilor Wright are abstaining. Although Councilor Baker has made clear that he is predisposed to support this eventually. I appreciate that. We may be short a number of councilors on Tuesday's meeting. It is a school vacation week, so we should think about whether we perhaps postpone this to the next meeting. But what we need to talk about now is the calendar. I have one question for Mr. Finlayson, which I could not ask before tonight, which is, although we have the authority and the power to decide when we want to make this effective, and I think we've made clear how to align it with building code, is there anything with respect to 10 communities that we would suffer as a result of not making it effective until July of 2024? I mean, maybe that means we make the 10 communities program effective as of July of 2024. If we're at that, you know, in 2024, we're ready to pass an ordinance with DOER's approval. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say the same thing that you did, that it would make sense for you to at least align them. You can either adopt the specialized code prior to the start of the 10 community demonstration or at the same time as it, but it wouldn't make sense to have the specialized code start later than your 10 community demonstration.
Okay, so given that we would be submitting an application to DOER in September, there's going to be some number of months, I imagine, for DOER to review the applications and approve them, maybe in this year, maybe in 2024. Do you have any, could you possibly have any sense of what the intention is there?
So I could speculate that we anticipate approving communities in plenty of time for January 1, because we know that there will be communities that do want to start that fossil fuel demonstration as soon as possible.
Okay.
I think that's partly why 4 communities have adopted effective July of 2023 on the specialized code.
Right, but that's too soon for us. So my question then to members of the committee is, although delaying till July of 2024 may feel more comfortable right now, possibly it gets in the way of our making the 10 communities program effective. On the other hand, we have a long road to hoe to get an ordinance, not Ms. Berwick's working on the ordinance, but to get it through our process and to hold a public hearing and all of that. So, and we now must include commercial buildings. So that portion of our community will be coming definitely interested in this proposal. So, Mike, I have a procedural question I'm not sure if anyone can answer. If we, let's say we go to full council with a recommendation to approve, and if we were to recommend the July 2024 date, could we come back at another time relative to the 10 communities and move the date up if we needed to? President Albright, do you?
I think it would have to be docketed to make,
sure.
a change. You docket the change, and then you could, and then we could make the,
so just it would just require redocketing,
right?
Okay.
Well, it would require a majority vote of the council because you'd have to taken the item up within 12 months.
Right.
Yes.
So.
Okay. Well, thank you. So there's a way to. I'm hearing people being more comfortable with a longer time frame at the moment, because I'm guessing it's because there's so much we don't know yet about how the rollout is working currently and so forth. I'm going to call on Ms. Berwick has her hand up, so maybe you can shed more light on this.
I can't shed more light on this. I just wanted to say that in some ways, approving the ordinance will be easier than it would have been without the 10 Communities program, because we have to closely model our ordinance on the model code. So it's not like we're going to have a lot of flexibility.
Yeah. So whatever we do tonight may need to be modified depending on whether we're accepted into the program on a faster time frame, possibly.
Yeah, I think the time frame issue is not so clear. I think the content of the ordinance and what will be approvable is reasonably clear. So not a lot of discretion on the part of the city. It's kind of an up or down thing.
Got it. Thank you. And Councilor Bowman, sorry to make you wait.
It's okay. It was good waiting because Ms. Berwick, I think, made my comments, what I wanted to say, even clearer. So I think, what we're hearing is concern from two sides of people councilors who've expressed concern about needing to give building professionals more time to get ready for the specialized code, as well as concerns about whether or not how long it will take us to develop the ordinance for the 10 communities. So we've just heard from Ms. Berwick that that's a pretty straightforward process because we're not going to have a lot of flexibility about it. And considering the strong support the full electrification had when we voted on it in the council, I would imagine that would be a relatively straightforward process. Now go back to the councilors who are concerned about giving the building community enough time to address and get ready for the specialized code. We have 4 communities who've adopted the code and it's going into effect in July. If we adopted this today or as soon as after today, it's still 9.5 months away. So we're in some regards we are giving more time to the building professionals in Newton to get prepared to deal with that. So I feel like it's plenty of time. I wouldn't want to do, I would highly suggest we vote for, implementing this as soon as possible so that we're not holding up our participation in the 10 communities and the full electrification. So I haven't heard from, we didn't hear from any building professionals that they were concerned about the adoption date and speeding it up. So I would highly suggest this committee adopt the January date. And I feel like you could always, if there is something that we overlook, we could push it back. But I feel like the January date's doable from the ordinance standpoint, and it's in line. In fact, it's even more time than 4 of our other communities have already given us. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Bowman. I have Councilor Ryan and then Baker.
Yeah, I just have a quick question. no matter what we do, won't we have to go back and change our code because of the gas stoves to be able to be part of the 10 communities?
Yes, we do. We have to follow the model ordinance, as Ms. Berwick claimed, for 10 communities. The date by which we make the specialized code effective is independent from that particular point, but related to, it has to be in effect before we can make the 10 communities program effective in Newton. So, Councillor Baker.
So I'm going to move in committee that we set the effective date as July 1st of 2024. Again, I think it's important to keep in mind that that is the date that the full the stretch code becomes fully effective in its increased requirements. And again, if we make it January for the specialized code, that accelerates the stretch code, which I think again may be a hardship to some of our building community. The other thing is that I think it's important that the 10 communities piece, as we've discussed, is important, but it's a separate question that has to be resolved independently. And I don't, we have to do the specialized code before we can do that. That sets the conditions, but it doesn't commit us fully to the 10 communities until everybody has a chance to sort out what that involves, as we've indicated earlier. So I think this is the best way to get us moving forward, but I think that's a committee decision. So, but I'd like to move that at least we put the July 2024 date on the recommendation.
Thank you. So as I understand it from the clerk, this is a straw vote. So I appreciate the motion, but the setting the time frame is a recommendation that we're making, but for some reason the item is a formal vote, and this, we can do it this way though. I mean, there's,
well, I don't understand why the date would be, it's part of the item, isn't it? I mean, we've got to set a date. The council has to, so we have to.
This was on the advice of the law department, Mr. Lee. So why don't we just vote on this, but understand that you know, this can be up for discussion in council as well.
That's fine. That's okay. I mean, let's not argue about that.
Okay. So, but what I would like to do is, if this item fails, then we'll ask for, so that we'll know how many people would rather have one date or the other. Okay. So all those in favor of recommending the effective date of the specialized code be July 1st of 2024, please raise your hand. Online, so we have 3 hands online, and we have 4 hands, Councillor Albright. So it looks like a split committee. All those, I hate to say all those opposed, because I would accept either date, but I think I'd rather have it sooner. But why don't I guess I have to say all those opposed. And then Councillor Danberg, you didn't raise your hand earlier, so I guess you're opposed. Yep, okay. So that's a failed.
Yes, I'm opposed. I feel the same way. I can accept either date, but would prefer the earlier one.
Okay, so I think given our advice from the law department, I can just report that to the full council that we, there are 4 folks who would prefer to have it on July 1st of 2024 and 4 folks who would prefer to have it on January 1st of 2024. I don't think it's really a failed vote in a way, because I think we're all interested in moving the code forward. So maybe we need to do a little more thinking interim about that, the timing. Does that sound right?
It's okay with me.
Okie doke. So I thought this was going to be a couple of hours, maybe 9:30. It's after 10:30, and I don't know about you folks, but I'm ready to adjourn. And but I do want to deeply thank.
We can't hear you.
You can't? Okay. Oh, sorry. I do want to deeply thank Ian Finlayson for not only being here, but staying for the entire evening, for patiently answering all of our questions on a topic that is, it's just not easy. And, you know, you just suffering through everybody's learning about this tonight. I have been working with Ms. Berwick over months, and in the committee did get a preview of this in December. So I don't want folks to think that we haven't been thinking about this for at all until tonight. But I want to deeply thank Ann Berwick for all of the work, blood, sweat, and tears you have put into a subject that is not your favorite. And
not my favorite.
Because it's made a huge difference. And I don't know if, I see John Logic is actually still on. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so glad you're back in the saddle. And everyone else, thank you. Thanks for the long night. Thanks for all of your comments and questions. And I guess that wraps it up. That's a wrap. Okay. Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.
Right.